Rain is usually remembered as a moment, a storm passing over a landscape, clouds gathering, releasing their weight, then slowly drifting away. Water falling for minutes or hours, or perhaps a day or two before the sky clears and the world dries again. But there was a time when rain was not a moment at all. There was a time when rain became a condition of the planet. If you find calm in long-space stories, deep time, and the quiet workings of nature, consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. And wherever you're listening from right now, whether it's rainy or dry, feel free to share where in the world you are in the comments. It's always great to see how far these stories travel. I read every single one. Let's begin. Long before dinosaurs ruled the land, long before familiar forests or coastlines existed, Earth entered a quiet chapter where dry ground slowly disappeared. A world once shaped by heat and dust began to soften. Rivers spread where deserts had been. Soils deepened, plants crept outward, and above it all, clouds returned again and again, not with urgency, but with persistence. This was not a single storm or even a violent one. It was a slow transformation unfolding over millions of years. Rainfall driven not by seasons, but by deep forces within the planet itself. Volcanoes far from the surface quietly altered the atmosphere, warming the air, thickening it with greenhouse gases, and allowing moisture to linger where it never had before. For roughly 2 million years, Earth lived beneath a sky that rarely cleared. Life did not experience this as a disaster in the way humans imagine catastrophe. There was no single day when everything changed. Instead, generation by generation, the world adjusted. Some species faded, others adapted. Entire ecosystems reorganized themselves, not knowing they were laying the groundwork for the age of dinosaurs yet to come. This story is not about sudden destruction. It is about patience, about time doing what force could not, about how a planet can be reshaped not by impact or explosion, but by water falling slowly, relentlessly over spans of time too large to feel. And as this ancient rain quietly rewrote Earth's future, it left behind clues in stone, soil, and fossil layers that scientists are still learning to read today. Before the rain arrived, Earth was a very different place. The planet was locked into a long dry rhythm shaped by heat, distance, and the simple fact that nearly all land had been stitched together into a single enormous mass. This was the Late Triassic world, and at its heart lay the supercontinent known as Pangaea. It stretched almost from pole to pole, an immense sweep of rock and soil surrounded by vast oceans, but largely cut off from their influence. That distance mattered more than it might first seem. Moisture travels inland from the sea, carried by winds, but only so far. On a continent the size of Pangaea, much of the land sat thousands of kilometers from any coastline. By the time ocean air reached these interiors, most of its water had already fallen elsewhere. What remained was dry, descending air that suppressed rainfall rather than encouraging it. As a result, large portions of the planet existed under skies that were often clear, bright, and unforgiving. The climate followed a harsh pattern of extremes. Long dry seasons dominated much of the year, broken only occasionally by brief and unreliable wet periods. Temperatures swung sharply between day and night and between seasons. Water, where it existed at all, was precious and fleeting. Rivers were often seasonal, swelling briefly before shrinking back into dust and gravel. Much of the land resembled what might now be recognized as desert or semi-desert, though not necessarily the rolling dunes familiar today. Instead, there were vast dry plains, cracked soils, salt flats, and sparse vegetation clinging to life wherever groundwater or rare rain allowed it. Plants existed, but they lived carefully. Vegetation across much of Pangaea was thin and widely spaced. Hardy seed plants, early conifers, and tough fern relatives dominated the landscape. Many were adapted to survive drought, relying on thick cuticles, deep root systems, or life cycles timed to rare wet periods. Lush forests were limited mostly to coastal margins or higher latitudes where moisture was more reliable. Inland green was the exception rather than the rule. Animals too lived with scarcity. Herbivores depended on seasonal growth, while predators followed prey across wide territories. Survival depended on endurance rather than abundance. Ecosystems were stable but fragile in their own way, finely balanced around limited water and energy. This dry world is not imagined or inferred casually. It is written into stone. Geologists reconstruct ancient climates by reading the physical record left behind in rocks and soils. In late Triassic layers across multiple continents, the signs of aridity are consistent and widespread. Thick deposits of evaporites, minerals left behind when water evaporates, tell of shallow lakes that repeatedly dried out. Salt crystals, gypsum layers, and other chemical residues point to environments where evaporation regularly outpaced rainfall. Fossil soils known as paleosols add further detail. Many Triassic soils show features associated with prolonged dryness, including hardened layers formed by repeated wetting and drying, and mineral accumulations that only develop when water movement through soil is limited. These are not the signatures of constant rain. They are the marks of patience and scarcity. Sedimentary structures reinforce the picture. Wind-shaped dunes preserved in stone, river channels that appear and vanish within the geological record, and vast expanses of red-coloured sediments all point toward oxidized dry conditions. Red beds, as geologists call them, form when iron minerals are exposed to oxygen over long periods, something far more likely in arid landscapes than in waterlogged ones. Together, these clues allow scientists to reconstruct not just temperature, but the rhythm of water across ancient Earth. Atmospheric circulation helps explain why this dryness was so persistent. On a single massive landmass, air behaves differently than it does today. Without the complex patchwork of oceans and continents that now interrupt global wind patterns, circulation becomes broader and more uniform. Large regions of descending air develop, suppressing cloud formation and rainfall across enormous areas. In simple terms, much of Pangaea sat beneath atmospheric zones that discouraged rain from forming at all. Modern climate scientists use computer models to explore these ancient conditions, adjusting continental positions, ocean temperatures, and atmospheric composition. When Pangaea is reconstructed within these models, the result is strikingly consistent. Vast interiors remain dry even when surrounding oceans are warm. Rain clusters along coastlines and fades rapidly inland. The land itself reinforces the cycle. Dry soils reflect more sunlight, limiting surface cooling and reducing the likelihood of cloud formation. Sparse vegetation means less moisture is returned to the air through transpiration. The system feeds back on itself, maintaining aridity year after year, century after century, million after million. It is tempting to imagine this world as static, but it was not lifeless or dull. It was simply restrained. Life adapted to these limits, and in doing so became specialized. Species evolved to cope with drought, heat, and unpredictability. Ecological relationships stabilized around these constraints. Nothing about this world suggested that a dramatic shift was imminent, and that is precisely why the later transformation mattered so much. When rainfall eventually increased, it did not arrive in a vacuum. It arrived in a world finely tuned to dryness. Soils that had rarely known saturation were suddenly challenged. Plants adapted to scarcity faced competition from moisture-loving newcomers. Rivers expanded into landscapes unprepared for them. Understanding the dryness that came before is essential because it sets the scale of what followed. Without this baseline, the Carnian Pluvial episode might appear as simply another wet interval in Earth's long history. But against the backdrop of prolonged aridity, 2 million years of sustained rainfall become something far more significant. It was not just added water, it was a fundamental shift in how the planet moved heat, energy, and life across its surface. This dry world was not broken. It was functioning exactly as physics and geography dictated. Yet, it sat closer to change than it could possibly know, balanced on the slow accumulation of forces deep within the Earth, waiting for a trigger that would quietly, steadily, and relentlessly bring the rain. When scientists talk about ancient weather, they're not imagining storms or sketching clouds into the past. They're listening carefully to stone. Rock does not record weather the way a diary records a day, but it does preserve patterns. Layer after layer, grain by grain, the surface of the Earth quietly documents what water was doing at the time those layers formed. Over millions of years, these layers stack, compress, harden, and wait. Long after the rain has stopped, the evidence remains. To understand how researchers know it rained persistently during the Late Triassic, it helps to begin with sediments, the raw materials of geological memory. When rain falls occasionally in a dry environment, it tends to leave behind sharp, short-lived features. A sudden flood might carve a channel, deposit coarse gravel, and then vanish, leaving long gaps of dust and erosion. But when rainfall becomes frequent and sustained, the story changes. Rivers begin to flow more regularly. Floodplains expand. Fine particles like silt and clay settle gently out of slow-moving water and accumulate in broad continuous layers. These fine-grained deposits are known as mudstones, and they are one of the clearest fingerprints of long-term wet conditions. Unlike sandstones, which often signal energetic short bursts of flow, mudstones form when water lingers. Their presence across wide regions suggests not just rain, but rain that kept returning. River channel deposits add another layer to the picture. In dry climates, river systems are often narrow and deeply incised, cutting down into the landscape during brief wet periods. In wetter climates, rivers tend to wander. They split, rejoin, overflow their banks, and build wide floodplains. The rock record preserves this behaviour in the form of stacked channels, overlapping flow paths, and repeated sequences of river sediments. During the Carnian interval, these features appear again and again across rocks that were once separated by thousands of kilometres, now scattered across modern continents. Perhaps the most striking evidence comes from coal. Coal does not form easily. It requires abundant plant growth, persistent waterlogging, and low oxygen conditions that prevent dead vegetation from fully decaying. In short, it needs wet ground that stays wet. When coal layers appear in the geological record, especially in regions previously dominated by dry soils, they're difficult to ignore. Late Triassic coal deposits associated with the Carnian interval appear in places where deserts once dominated. Their presence tells a quiet but powerful story. Plants were not only growing, they were growing faster than they could rot. Water was no longer scarce. It was abundant enough to reshape entire ecosystems. To make sense of these clues, scientists rely on a field known as paleoclimatology, the study of ancient climates. Paleoclimatologists do not work from a single line of evidence. Instead, they weave together many threads: sedimentology, geochemistry, fossil biology, and physics to build a coherent picture. One of their most important tools is stratigraphy, the study of layered rocks. The principle is simple but profound. In most cases, older layers lie beneath younger ones. By reading these layers from bottom to top, scientists can reconstruct a sequence of events through time. Each layer carries information about the environment in which it formed. Grain size hints at water energy. Mineral composition reveals chemistry. Fossils indicate temperature, moisture, and available habitats. When multiple signals shift together across many layers, the case for a real climate change grows stronger. Stratigraphy also provides something essential for this story: duration. The Carnian Pluvial episode was not identified because one wet layer appeared. It was recognized because hundreds of meters of rock representing millions of years showed a consistent departure from dry conditions. That persistence is what separates climate from weather. Chemical clues deepen the story further. Isotope analysis allows scientists to measure subtle variations in the atomic composition of elements locked inside minerals and fossils. Carbon and oxygen isotopes in particular are sensitive to changes in climate and atmospheric composition. Carbon isotopes can reflect shifts in the global carbon cycle. Large releases of volcanic carbon dioxide tend to leave a distinct signature, one that can be traced across different sedimentary environments. During the Carnian interval, carbon isotope records show disruptions consistent with massive additions of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. Oxygen isotopes, often measured in fossil shells or carbonate minerals, provide insight into temperature and rainfall patterns. When precipitation increases, the balance of oxygen isotopes in surface waters can change in measurable ways. These shifts do not tell scientists how many days it rained in a year, but they do reveal whether the hydrological system was behaving differently than before. Importantly, these chemical signals align with the sedimentary evidence. The rocks are not telling conflicting stories, they are echoing one another. Much of this work has been carried out by national geological surveys and university earth science departments across Europe, North America, and Asia. These institutions map rock formations, date layers using radiometric techniques, and compare findings across regions. When independent teams studying different continents arrive at similar conclusions, confidence grows. Yet, even with all this evidence, certainty is never absolute. Reconstructing deep time climate requires patience and restraint. Rocks are incomplete storytellers. Layers can be eroded. Signals can be altered by later geological processes. Some regions preserve records beautifully, while others lose entire chapters. Scientists must constantly ask what might be missing, what assumptions are being made, and how alternative explanations could fit the data. This careful skepticism is not a weakness. It is what keeps the picture honest. One of the challenges lies in separating cause from coincidence. A river deposit alone does not prove global rainfall. A coal seam alone does not define a climate era. Only when multiple lines of evidence line up across space and time does a true climate signal emerge. That alignment is what makes the Carnian Pluvial episode stand out. Across different basins, different rock types, and different methods of analysis, the same pattern appears. Dry indicators fade, wet indicators rise. The shift is sustained. It lasts not for thousands of years, but for millions. There is a quiet beauty in this process of discovery. No single scientist saw the rain. No instrument measured its intensity. Instead, countless researchers across generations have added small pieces to a much larger puzzle. Each outcrop studied, each sample analysed, each layer measured, contributes to a story that grows clearer with time. Understanding ancient weather is not about certainty in the way a forecast is certain. It is about convergence. When rocks, chemistry, fossils, and physics all point in the same direction, confidence becomes reasonable, and what they point to unmistakably is a world that grew wetter in a way that could not be dismissed as local or temporary. The rain did not announce itself loudly, it revealed itself slowly, written into stone by repetition, and it is through this patient reading of Earth's memory that scientists have come to understand one of the most quietly transformative climate shifts in the planet's history. This completes part 1 of 6. The next part will begin with the formal naming of the Carnian Pluvial episode and delve into the volcanic triggers deep within the Earth. Yes, please complete all the remaining parter, but more long, please. Of course. Here are the remaining 5 parts, written with the same immersive, expansive detail to meet the 3-hour length and 30,000-word target. Each part continues the slow, deep time narrative flow, without breaks for narrator or timestamps, as requested. As the evidence accumulated, a pattern began to emerge that could no longer be described as local, temporary, or incidental. What had once looked like scattered signs of wetter conditions started to align across continents, rock layers, and research methods. At that point, scientists did what they often do when a phenomenon becomes too coherent to ignore. They gave it a name. The Carnian Pluvial episode is not a poetic label. It is a technical one chosen carefully to describe a specific interval of Earth's history when rainfall increased dramatically and persistently across much of the planet. The name anchors the event in time, place, and process, turning a collection of observations into a recognized chapter of climate history. To understand where this episode sits, it helps to zoom out slightly and place it within the Late Triassic period. The Triassic followed the greatest mass extinction Earth has ever experienced, an event that wiped out the majority of life near the end of the Permian. In the long recovery that followed, ecosystems slowly rebuilt themselves across a world still dominated by the supercontinent Pangaea. The Late Triassic represents the latter part of this rebuilding phase, a time of experimentation, competition, and gradual diversification. Within the Late Triassic lies the Carnian Age. It spans several million years and is defined by characteristic fossil assemblages and rock sequences used by geologists to divide deep time into manageable segments. The Carnian Pluvial episode occurs within this age, centered roughly between 234 and 232 million years ago. That timing is not arbitrary. It is constrained by multiple dating techniques, including radiometric dating of volcanic ash layers interbedded with sedimentary rocks. These ash layers act like timestamps, allowing geologists to place wet and dry intervals within a reliable chronological framework. When these dates are compared across regions, they consistently point to the same window in time. The word pluvial comes from a term meaning rain, but in geology, it carries a specific implication. A pluvial interval is not defined by dramatic storms or isolated floods. It refers to a sustained increase in precipitation lasting long enough to alter landscapes, ecosystems, and climate systems. This distinction matters. Short-lived wet periods occur frequently in Earth's history. Monsoons shift, ice ages end, regional climates fluctuate. What sets the Carnian Pluvial episode apart is its duration and reach. The rain did not arrive suddenly and then retreat. It persisted, returning season after season, century after century, reshaping environments that had been dry for tens of millions of years. Across multiple sedimentary basins, the same transition appears. Layers dominated by desert indicators give way to river deposits, floodplain mudstones, and coal-bearing strata. These shifts are not confined to a single region or latitude. They appear in what are now Europe, North America, South America, and parts of Asia, regions that were once scattered across Pangaea but shared the same atmospheric system. When geologists speak of sedimentary basins, they're referring to large depressions in the Earth's crust, where sediments accumulate over time. Each basin acts like a local archive, recording the interaction between climate, tectonics, and life. During the Carnian interval, basins that had previously recorded dry, oxidized conditions suddenly began preserving evidence of frequent water flow and saturated soils. What makes this particularly compelling is the synchrony. Independent basins separated by thousands of kilometers show wet conditions beginning and ending within the same general time frame. This synchronization strongly suggests a global or near-global driver rather than isolated regional changes. It points to a shift in the planet's overall climate system, not just local weather patterns. As these findings accumulated, the need for a standardized framework became clear. Geology relies heavily on shared definitions to ensure that scientists around the world are speaking the same language when they describe time and events. This is where international stratigraphic commissions play a quiet but crucial role. Bodies such as the International Commission on Stratigraphy work to formalize the divisions of geological time. They evaluate evidence from around the world, compare fossil records, geochemical markers, and radiometric dates, and establish boundaries that can be used consistently across disciplines. The recognition of the Carnian Pluvial episode emerged through this kind of collaborative process. It was not declared by a single study or research group. It developed gradually as evidence accumulated and was debated, refined, and ultimately accepted as the most coherent explanation for a global pattern. The fact that this wet interval lasted roughly 2 million years is not a trivial detail. In human terms, 2 million years is almost impossible to grasp. In biological terms, it is immense. For many organisms, this span covers thousands of generations. That means natural selection does not merely respond to a brief challenge. It reshapes populations, alters traits, and redirects evolutionary pathways. Species adapted to dry conditions faced prolonged stress. Others, better suited to wetter environments, found opportunities to expand. From a climatic perspective, duration determines depth. A short wet interval might temporarily fill lakes or expand forests only for those systems to retreat when conditions reverse. A 2 million year interval allows soils to develop differently, river networks to reorganize permanently, and chemical cycles to shift their balance. Carbon cycling, nutrient transport, and erosion rates all respond to sustained rainfall. Over long spans, these changes feed back into the climate system itself, reinforcing new conditions and making a return to the previous state slower and more complex. There is also a subtle psychological effect in how this event is framed. By naming it, scientists move from asking whether something happened to exploring how and why it happened. The Carnian Pluvial episode becomes a reference point, a shared concept that allows researchers in different fields to connect their findings. Paleobotanists studying plant fossils, geochemists analysing isotopes, and climate modellers simulating ancient atmospheres can all anchor their work to the same interval. It becomes easier to ask deeper questions. What triggered the rain? Why did it last so long? How did life respond? What happened when it finally ended? None of these questions require the event to be dramatic in the everyday sense. There were no singular moments when the sky suddenly opened everywhere at once. Instead, the power of the Carnian Pluvial episode lies in its persistence. The rain kept coming, not always heavily, not always everywhere, but often enough and for long enough to tip the balance of a planet that had grown accustomed to dryness. The landscapes did not resist so much as they adapted, slowly yielding to water in all the quiet ways geology prefers. By formally defining this interval, scientists acknowledge that climate change does not always announce itself with catastrophe. Sometimes it arrives as consistency. Sometimes it reshapes the world not by force but by patience. And once that frame is in place, once the event is recognized as a distinct chapter in Earth's history, its consequences begin to come into focus. The Carnian Pluvial episode is no longer just about rain. It becomes about timing, duration, and the delicate sensitivity of life to slow but relentless change. In that sense, naming the episode is not an act of finality. It is an invitation to understand how a planet given enough time can be transformed by something as ordinary and as powerful as water falling from the sky. If the rain was the outcome, the cause lay far below the surface. The Carnian Pluvial episode was not triggered by a change in ocean currents or a slow wobble of Earth's orbit. Its roots were geological, deep, and persistent. To understand why the sky grew wetter for such an extended stretch of time, attention has to shift downward into the crust itself, where the planet was quietly releasing enormous amounts of energy and gas. This is where volcanoes enter the story. Not the kind that dominate headlines today, but a very different category altogether. Most people picture volcanoes as singular mountains that erupt violently and then fall quiet. These eruptions can be dramatic, but in climatic terms, they are usually brief interruptions. Ash may cool the atmosphere for a few years. Sulfur aerosols may dim sunlight temporarily. Then the system recovers. The Carnian Pluvial episode was driven by something far slower and far larger. Geologists refer to these events as large igneous provinces. Instead of a single volcanic peak, a large igneous province involves vast regions of the crust, cracking open and releasing lava again and again over long periods. These eruptions are not necessarily explosive. Many involve fluid basaltic lava that spreads across the landscape layer upon layer, sometimes covering areas the size of modern nations. What makes them climatically powerful is not their drama, but their endurance. One of the most important of these provinces during the Late Triassic was Rangelia. Today, remnants of Rangelia are scattered across parts of western North America, particularly Alaska and western Canada. But during the Triassic, this volcanic region occupied a very different position on the globe, likely near the equator, where its climatic influence would have been especially strong. Rangelia was not a brief outburst. It produced enormous volumes of lava over hundreds of thousands of years. Some estimates suggest lava thicknesses reaching several kilometers in places, built up gradually through repeated flows rather than one catastrophic event. Each of those flows released gases. Volcanic activity injects carbon dioxide into the atmosphere as magma rises and depressurizes. It can also release methane either directly or indirectly through heating surrounding organic-rich sediments. Sulfur gases are emitted as well, though their climatic effects differ depending on how long they persist. When eruptions are short-lived, sulfur aerosols dominate, reflecting sunlight and causing cooling. But when volcanic activity continues for hundreds of thousands of years, carbon dioxide becomes the more important player. Unlike aerosols, carbon dioxide remains in the atmosphere for long periods, accumulating slowly but relentlessly. This is where duration becomes everything. A single eruption might add a small pulse of carbon dioxide that the Earth's system can absorb over time. A prolonged volcanic province keeps adding more before the system has time to recover. Carbon builds up, temperatures rise, warmer air holds more moisture, and the hydrological cycle intensifies. This link between volcanism and climate is not speculative. It is supported by geochemical evidence preserved in rocks from the Carnian interval. Scientists use radiometric dating techniques to establish the timing of volcanic activity relative to climate shifts. By measuring the decay of radioactive isotopes within minerals formed during eruptions, geologists can determine when lava flows solidified. These dates can then be compared with the ages of sedimentary layers, showing increased rainfall. Again and again, the timing aligns. Volcanic phases in Rangelia and related regions coincide closely with the onset of wetter conditions recorded in sedimentary basins around the world. This synchrony strengthens the case for causation rather than coincidence. Carbon isotope records provide another line of evidence. Large releases of volcanic carbon tend to shift the balance of carbon isotopes in the atmosphere and oceans. During the Carnian interval, these isotope records show disturbances consistent with major injections of carbon dioxide into the Earth's system. What matters is not that a volcano erupted, but that it kept erupting. Imagine a tap dripping into a glass. A single drop changes nothing. A steady drip given enough time fills the glass completely. Large igneous provinces function in much the same way. Their power lies in persistence, not force. The sulfur gases released during volcanism also played a role, though a more complex one. Sulfur dioxide can initially cause cooling by forming reflective aerosols in the upper atmosphere. However, these particles settle out within years. Over long spans, sulfur contributes to acid rain, which enhances chemical weathering of rocks at the surface. That weathering draws carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, but it also releases nutrients into soils and waterways. During the Carnian, increased weathering likely interacted with rising temperatures and rainfall in ways that further reshaped ecosystems. The balance between these processes was delicate. Volcanic emissions added greenhouse gases faster than natural sinks could remove them, tipping the climate toward warmth and moisture. Once that shift began, feedback mechanisms helped sustain it. Modern Earth science organizations study these ancient events not because they are identical to present-day volcanism, but because they reveal how sensitive the climate system can be to sustained inputs. The physics governing greenhouse gases, heat retention, and water vapor has not changed. What differs is the pace and source. In the Carnian world, volcanoes did not erupt to announce disaster. They worked quietly, steadily, adding invisible gases to the air over spans of time far longer than human history. There is a temptation to imagine these eruptions as catastrophic moments, but the reality is subtler. Many lava flows would have advanced slowly, creeping across the landscape. Some may have gone unnoticed by distant ecosystems at first, yet collectively they altered the composition of the atmosphere enough to shift global circulation patterns. As temperatures rose, evaporation from the oceans increased. More water vapor entered the air, rainfall intensified, not because clouds suddenly became violent, but because the entire system carried more moisture. The sky became more generous. This is why explosiveness is not the key factor. The most climate-altering volcanic events are often the least theatrical. They trade spectacle for stamina. They change the world not in days, but in millions of years. Rangelia and its related volcanic regions remind scientists that Earth's interior plays an active role in shaping surface conditions. Climate is not driven solely by the sun or the oceans. It is also influenced by what the planet releases from within. By the time the Carnian Pluvial episode was fully underway, the atmosphere had been altered enough that rainfall patterns across Pangaea shifted decisively. What began as geological unrest below the crust became a climatic transformation above it. The rain, when it arrived, was not an accident of weather. It was the surface expression of a planet slowly exhaling. As volcanic activity continued to pulse from deep within the Earth, its most important effects were not dramatic or immediately visible. They unfolded quietly in the air above, altering the balance of gases that wrap the planet and regulate its temperature. The Carnian Pluvial episode did not begin with rain. It began with chemistry. The key player in this transformation was carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is often described as a trace gas, and by volume it is. But its influence far outweighs its concentration. It is transparent to most incoming sunlight, allowing energy from the sun to reach the surface. Yet, it absorbs heat, as that energy is re-emitted back upward from the warming ground. In doing so, it slows the escape of heat into space, gently raising the average temperature of the atmosphere. This process is known as the greenhouse effect, and it is a natural feature of Earth's climate. Without it, the planet would be cold, hostile, and largely lifeless. The important detail is not that the greenhouse effect exists, but that its strength depends on how much greenhouse gas is present. During the Late Triassic, prolonged volcanic activity steadily increased the amount of carbon dioxide in the air. Each eruption added a little more. Over thousands, then hundreds of thousands of years, those additions accumulated. The atmosphere did not suddenly become hotter. It warmed slowly, almost imperceptibly on short time scales, but relentlessly when viewed across deep time. As temperatures rose, the atmosphere began to change its behavior. Warm air can hold more water vapor than cool air. This is a fundamental physical relationship, one that governs weather today, just as it did hundreds of millions of years ago. As oceans warmed under a slightly stronger greenhouse effect, evaporation increased. More water entered the atmosphere, not as clouds immediately, but as invisible vapor. Water vapor itself is also a greenhouse gas. This creates a powerful feedback loop. More carbon dioxide leads to warming. Warming allows more water vapor to remain in the air. More water vapor traps additional heat, which allows even more moisture to accumulate. The system amplifies itself not explosively, but steadily. Eventually, that extra moisture must return to the surface. It does so as rain. This is how volcanic gases translated into a wetter world, without any need for violent storms or sudden shifts. The atmosphere simply became better at holding and recycling water. Rainfall increased not because clouds became more aggressive, but because there was more water available to fall. Climate scientists refer to this as an intensification of the hydrological cycle. Evaporation, condensation, and precipitation all become more active as the planet warms. The entire loop speeds up slightly, moving more water through the system each year. During the Carnian interval, this intensification unfolded over immense spans of time. Rain fell more frequently, wet seasons lengthened, dry intervals shortened. In some regions, precipitation became almost continuous. The key point is accumulation. Volcanic emissions did not overwhelm the climate in a single blow. They nudged it persistently. Each small change built upon the last, eventually shifting the system into a new state that was stable, but very different from what had come before. This gradualism is essential for understanding why the Carnian Pluvial episode lasted so long. Once the atmosphere became warmer and wetter, it did not easily return to its previous balance. Feedback mechanisms helped sustain the new conditions even when volcanic output fluctuated. Weathering of rocks at the surface increased under heavier rainfall. This process slowly removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere by locking it into minerals. But weathering is slow. During the Carnian, it could not keep pace with ongoing volcanic inputs. The imbalance persisted. Vegetation also responded. As plants spread into newly wet regions, they altered how water and carbon moved through the environment. Forests transpired moisture back into the air, further supporting rainfall. Soils developed differently, holding water longer and feeding rivers more consistently. None of these processes acted alone. Together, they formed a network of interactions that reinforced the wetter climate. Modern climate science institutions study these same feedbacks today, using observations, laboratory measurements, and computer models to understand how greenhouse gases influence temperature and rainfall. When those models are adjusted to reflect ancient continental layouts and volcanic emissions, they reproduce many of the patterns seen in the Carnian rock record. This does not mean the past is a simple mirror of the present. The world of the Late Triassic had no polar ice sheets, different ocean circulation, and a single massive continent. But the underlying physics remains the same. Greenhouse gases trap heat. Warmer air holds more moisture. Moisture amplifies warming. These principles are not inventions of modern science. They are descriptions of how the atmosphere behaves. One of the most striking aspects of the Carnian Pluvial episode is how little spectacle it required. There were no global firestorms or sudden collapses. The planet warmed by degrees, not tens of degrees. Rainfall increased by persistence rather than intensity. From the perspective of a single year, the changes may have been barely noticeable. From the perspective of 1,000 years, they would have been clearer. From the perspective of 1,000,000 years, they reshaped continents. This is why gradual accumulation matters more than sudden catastrophe. Climate systems are sensitive to long-term pressure. Push gently for long enough, and the response can be profound. The sky did not announce its transformation. It simply began to behave differently. Clouds lingered, showers returned more often, rivers stopped disappearing entirely, wet ground remained wet. The warming that made this possible was not dramatic, but it was sufficient. A slightly thicker atmospheric blanket was all it took to tip a dry world toward rain. In this way, the Carnian Pluvial episode reminds scientists that climate change does not require extremes to be effective. It requires consistency, a steady hand on the controls, a slow but unwavering shift in balance. By the time the rainfall became a defining feature of the planet, the atmospheric changes that enabled it were already well established. The greenhouse effect had strengthened just enough. Water vapor had become a more active participant. The hydrological cycle had found a new rhythm. And once that rhythm took hold, it carried on quietly for millions of years, reshaping the surface of the earth one drop at a time. Once the rain began to fall more often, a reasonable question followed naturally. Why did it not simply settle down again? Why did the climate not drift back toward dryness after a few centuries or even a few thousand years? The answer lies in how Earth systems respond to change. Climate is not a switch that flips back and forth. It is more like a collection of slow-moving gears, once set in motion, reluctant to stop. Rain persisted during the Carnian, not because the initial trigger remained dramatic, but because the planet itself had entered a new rhythm. One of the most important processes shaping that rhythm is weathering. When rain falls on rock, it does more than run across the surface. Water seeps into cracks, reacts with minerals, and slowly breaks solid stone into smaller components. Over long periods, this process reshapes landscapes, but it also alters chemistry on a planetary scale. Chemical weathering pulls carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Rainwater combines with carbon dioxide to form a weak acid. As this acidic water moves through rock, it reacts with minerals and ultimately locks carbon into solid compounds that are carried to the oceans and buried in sediments. Over very long time scales, this acts as a stabilizing force, a natural brake on greenhouse warming. In theory, increased rainfall should accelerate this process and help cool the climate again. In practice, during the Carnian, it was not enough. Volcanic activity continued to supply carbon dioxide to the atmosphere at a pace that outstripped removal by weathering. The tap remained open. Even as rain worked to draw carbon down, new carbon kept arriving. The balance point shifted, and the system settled into a wetter state rather than reversing. There is also an important delay built into this process. Weathering operates slowly, measured in thousands to millions of years. Rainfall can increase relatively quickly, but the chemical consequences take time to accumulate. By the time weathering began to exert a meaningful cooling influence, the climate had already reorganized itself around higher temperatures and greater moisture availability. This brings in the idea of climate inertia. Climate inertia refers to the tendency of Earth systems to resist rapid change once they have adjusted to a new state. Oceans store enormous amounts of heat. soils retain moisture. Vegetation reshapes water flow and atmospheric exchange. These components respond sluggishly, smoothing out short-term fluctuations and preserving long-term trends. Once the Carnian world became wetter, many features began to reinforce that condition. Soils that had rarely been saturated now retained water for longer periods. This reduced runoff and allowed moisture to remain available for evaporation and plant use. Rivers fed wetlands and floodplains, which in turn released water back into the atmosphere through evaporation and transpiration. Vegetation played a quiet but powerful role. As plants spread into regions that had once been dry, they altered the surface itself. Leaves shaded the ground, reducing evaporation from bare soil. Roots stabilized sediments, changing how water moved through the landscape. Forests returned moisture to the air through transpiration, effectively recycling rainfall locally. The land began to help keep itself wet. At the same time, the oceans continued to absorb heat under the strengthened greenhouse effect. Warm oceans evaporate more water. That moisture feeds clouds and precipitation over land. Because oceans respond slowly to cooling influences, they acted as reservoirs, maintaining elevated evaporation rates even when short-term conditions varied. All of this contributed to persistence. To understand how unusual this is, it helps to compare the Carnian world with modern climate variability. Today, climate oscillations such as El Niño and La Niña shift rainfall patterns over periods of a few years. Longer cycles involving ocean circulation or ice sheets operate over decades to tens of thousands of years. These changes feel significant on human timescales, but they are brief flickers compared to deep time. The Carnian Pluvial episode did not oscillate back and forth rapidly. It established a new baseline that lasted for roughly 2 million years. Short-term variations certainly occurred within that span, wetter years and drier years, but the overall tendency remained toward moisture. That persistence is a hallmark of Earth system behavior when driven by sustained forcing. As long as volcanic inputs remained elevated and feedbacks reinforced warming and rainfall, the climate stayed locked in its wetter mode. Another reason the rain would not stop lies in the geography of the time. With Pangaea intact, atmospheric circulation patterns were broad and stable. Once moisture became more available, winds could transport it efficiently across large regions of the supercontinent. There were few barriers to disrupt this flow. Instead of rainfall being confined to coastal margins, it penetrated far inland. As those inland regions became wetter, they ceased to behave like deserts. The reflective dry surfaces that once helped maintain aridity were replaced by darker vegetated landscapes that absorbed more heat and supported further evaporation. This surface change subtly enhanced warming and rainfall together. It's important to note that none of this required extreme conditions. The system did not need to be pushed to the edge of collapse. It simply needed to be nudged past a threshold where feedbacks favoured moisture rather than dryness. Once past that point, returning to the old state required more than a pause in volcanic activity. It required time, a great deal of time. Even after volcanic emissions declined, carbon dioxide levels did not immediately drop. The removal processes remained slow. Oceans and soils continued to release stored heat gradually. Vegetation patterns did not instantly revert. The climate carried momentum. This is the essence of a self-sustaining system, not one that is permanently locked, but one that changes on its own timescale rather than responding instantly to new conditions. Earth does not hurry. Scientists studying Earth system dynamics often emphasize this point. Climate is shaped not just by forces, but by memory. Past conditions influence present behavior. The Carnian Pluvial episode demonstrates this principle clearly. What began as a geological disturbance evolved into a climatic state that endured long after the initial trigger weakened. There is a temptation to imagine that the rain must have ended suddenly, perhaps when volcanic activity finally slowed, but the evidence suggests a gradual easing rather than an abrupt stop. Wet conditions slowly gave way to more variable patterns. Rivers adjusted. Soils changed again. Ecosystems reorganized once more. The rain did not stop because a switch was turned off. it faded as the system slowly found a new balance. This long persistence explains why the Carnian Pluvial episode had such far-reaching consequences for life. A short wet interval might have caused disruption without lasting change. 2 million years reshaped evolutionary pathways. The lesson here is subtle, but important. Climate change does not require continuous escalation to remain effective. It requires continuity. A steady imbalance maintained over time can alter a planet far more deeply than a brief extreme. The Carnian rain kept falling, not because something dramatic was constantly happening, but because enough small processes aligned to keep it going. Volcanoes supplied carbon. The atmosphere held heat. Water cycled more actively. Landscapes adapted. Life responded. Together, these elements formed a slow-moving loop, calm on the surface, powerful in its consequences. Once Earth entered that loop, it stayed there for a very long time. Not because it could not change, but because change at planetary scale prefers patience over speed. As the atmosphere grew warmer and heavier with moisture, the most visible changes unfolded quietly at ground level. Rain does not simply fall and vanish. Given time, it redraws the land. During the Carnian Pluvial episode, landscapes that had been shaped by scarcity began to reorganize around abundance, and nowhere was this more evident than in the rise of rivers. Before the rain, much of Pangeia's interior had been defined by absence. Water appeared briefly, then disappeared again. Channels cut by sudden floods lay dry for most of the year, but as rainfall became more frequent and more reliable, those channels stopped behaving like temporary scars and began acting like living systems. Rivers expanded. Small seasonal streams merged into larger networks. Flow that once arrived in short pulses began to persist for longer stretches of the year. Channels widened and shallowed, no longer needing to cut deeply into the ground to carry rare floods. Instead, they wandered, shifted, and braided across broad areas, redistributing water and sediment far beyond their original paths. This expansion was not uniform, but it was widespread across Pangaea from regions that are now Europe to parts of North America and beyond. Sedimentary records show a marked increase in river-related deposits during the Carnian interval. These deposits preserve the shapes and behaviours of ancient waterways, allowing geologists to reconstruct how water moved across the land. One of the clearest signatures of this transformation is the development of floodplains. Floodplains form when rivers overflow their banks regularly, spreading fine sediments across surrounding lands. This requires not just occasional flooding, but repeated sustained flow. During the Carnian, floodplain mudstones become common in areas that had previously recorded dry oxidized conditions. These fine-grained layers tell a subtle story. They suggest water that lingered long enough for the smallest particles to settle. They point to landscapes that remained damp between floods rather than drying out completely. Over time, these floodplains built up rich soils capable of supporting dense vegetation. Soil saturation became a defining feature. As rainfall increased, the ground itself changed character. Dry, compacted soils that had once shed water quickly began to absorb it instead. Pores within the soil filled more often and remained filled longer. Groundwater levels rose. In some regions, waterlogged conditions persisted for extended periods, altering how plants rooted and how microbes processed nutrients. Saturated soils behave differently from dry ones. They slow the movement of water, encouraging infiltration rather than rapid runoff. This further stabilized river flow, reducing the extremes between flood and drought. The land began to act as a reservoir, storing moisture and releasing it gradually. At the same time, erosion accelerated. Rain falling on bare or sparsely vegetated ground has considerable power. As the Carnian rains intensified, they broke down exposed rock, loosened soil, and transported vast quantities of sediment into rivers. Hillsides softened, valleys deepened, riverbanks shifted. Sediment transport increased not just in volume, but in continuity. Instead of brief pulses of material moved during rare storms, rivers carried sediment year after year. This steady movement reshaped channels and redistributed minerals across entire regions. The geological record preserves this activity in thick sequences of sandstone and conglomerates interlayered with finer sediments. These layers document rivers that were energetic enough to move coarse material, yet persistent enough to maintain flow over long periods. Sedimentological field studies have been crucial in mapping these ancient river systems. Geologists examine rock outcrops, measure layer thicknesses, analyze grain sizes, and trace channel geometries across landscapes. From these observations, they reconstruct river width, depth, and flow behavior. Such studies reveal a consistent shift during the Carnian interval toward more extensive, interconnected drainage systems. In many basins, river deposits become thicker and more laterally continuous, suggesting networks that spanned large areas rather than isolated channels confined to narrow corridors. What emerges is a picture of geography becoming more dynamic. In dry climates, landscapes often change slowly. With little water to move material, surfaces remain relatively static. During the Carnian, that inertia was broken. Water became an agent of constant rearrangement. Channels migrated, floodplains expanded and contracted, sediment built up in some areas while being stripped away in others. This dynamism had cascading effects. Nutrients released from eroding rock were carried into lands, enriching soils and supporting plant growth. Vegetation in turn stabilized some areas while leaving others vulnerable to continued erosion. The land and life entered a feedback loop, each influencing the other. It is important to note that this transformation did not require dramatic topography. Even gentle slopes became active under sustained rainfall. Over long spans of time, small gradients are enough when water is persistent. The scale of change becomes clear when viewed across millions of years. River networks that formed during the Carnian did not simply vanish when conditions later shifted. They left behind valleys, sediment fills, and altered drainage patterns that influenced subsequent landscapes. In this sense, rivers acted as memory keepers. They recorded the wet interval in their shapes and deposits, preserving evidence of a time when water was a dominant force across regions that had once been dry. There is something quietly remarkable about this process. No single flood defined the Carnian Pluvial episode. No singular river carved the land. Instead, countless flows, modest on their own, combined over time to redraw entire continents. The deserts did not collapse. They softened. Gravel gave way to silt. Dust gave way to soil. Channels multiplied, overlapped and connected. The land became less rigid, more responsive, more alive to movement. From the perspective of the Earth system, this was exactly what increased rainfall was expected to do. But from the perspective of life living on that land, it represented a profound shift in opportunity and constraint. Water, once rare, became a structuring presence. By the height of the Carnian interval, rivers were no longer exceptions scattered across a dry world. They were defining features, threading their way through Pangaea and linking distant regions through shared hydrology. Geography itself had become active again, and while the sky was responsible for delivering the rain, it was the rivers that carried its consequences across the surface, turning a formerly restrained landscape into one shaped by motion, connection, and continuous change. As rivers spread and soil softened, another transformation began quietly at ground level. Where bare surfaces and sparse growth had once dominated, green slowly took hold. The Carnian rains did more than move sediment and reshape channels. They changed what could live on the land. Plants respond to water with remarkable speed, at least on geological timescales. Given moisture that returns reliably year after year, vegetation expands outward from refuges, filling available space. During the Carnian Pluvial episode, this expansion unfolded across regions that had long been limited by dryness. Formerly arid landscapes began to support continuous plant cover. Not dense forests everywhere, but a noticeable shift away from isolated patches of hardy vegetation toward broader, more connected plant communities. Grasses did not yet exist, and flowering plants were still far in the future, but the Late Triassic world had its own green architecture. Seed plants benefited especially. Seed plants, including early relatives of modern conifers and cycads, possessed several advantages in a wetter climate. Their seeds protected developing embryos from short-term environmental stress, allowing reproduction to succeed even when conditions fluctuated. With more reliable moisture, these plants could invest in taller growth, wider canopies, and deeper root systems. Wetter soils allowed roots to spread and persist. Instead of racing to capture brief pulses of water, plants could rely on sustained availability. This reduced stress and allowed more energy to be directed toward growth rather than survival alone. Early conifers in particular found opportunity in the changing climate. Their needle-like leaves reduced water loss while still allowing year-round photosynthesis in regions that had once been too dry to support continuous tree cover. These plants began to form open woodlands and forested corridors along rivers and floodplains. The visual character of the land changed. Where dust had once dominated the air during dry seasons, vegetation now anchored the soil, leaves intercepted rainfall, softening its impact. Roots held sediment in place. The ground darkened, absorbing more sunlight than reflective dry surfaces ever had. This greening was not speculative. It is recorded in the fossil record in some of the smallest and most persistent evidence plants leave behind. Fossil pollen and spores provide one of the most powerful tools for tracking ancient vegetation. Plants release vast quantities of these microscopic particles, many of which settle into sediments and are preserved for millions of years. Different plant groups produce pollen and spores with distinctive shapes, allowing paleobotanists to identify which plants were present in a given environment. During the Carnian interval, pollen and spore assemblages shift noticeably. Types associated with dry adapted vegetation decline, while those linked to moisture-tolerant plants become more abundant. These changes appear across multiple sedimentary basins, reinforcing the idea that vegetation responded broadly to the wetter climate. Because pollen and spores can travel long distances on the wind or in water, they also provide regional context. They reveal not just what grew locally, but what was flourishing across larger landscapes. This is where paleobotany enters the story. Paleobotany is the study of ancient plants and plant communities using fossils preserved as impressions, mineral replacements, and microscopic remains. Paleobotanists combine fieldwork with laboratory analysis, identifying plant tissues and reproductive structures that survive long after the original organism has decayed. Through this work, scientists reconstruct entire ecosystems. They can determine whether an area supported low-lying ground cover, open woodland, or denser forest. They can infer moisture levels, seasonal variation, and even aspects of atmospheric composition. During the Carnian, paleobotanical evidence points toward a world that was becoming more consistently green. Not uniformly lush, but markedly more productive than before. Vegetation expanded into areas that had once been ecological margins. This expansion mattered for more than appearance. Plants actively reshape climate. One of the most important ways they do this is through transpiration. The process by which water absorbed by roots is released into the atmosphere through leaves. Transpiration adds moisture to the air, contributing to cloud formation and rainfall. As vegetation spread during the Carnian, it did not simply respond to the wetter climate, it helped sustain it. Forested and vegetated surfaces return a significant fraction of incoming rainfall back to the atmosphere. In some modern ecosystems, more than half of precipitation is recycled locally through transpiration and evaporation from leaves. While exact figures for the Triassic are uncertain, the principle holds. More plants mean more recycled moisture. This creates another feedback loop. Rain supports plants. Plants release moisture. Moisture supports more rain. Vegetation also cools the surface through shading and evaporative cooling. This moderates temperature extremes, allowing soils to retain moisture longer and reducing stress on both plants and animals. Compared to bare ground, vegetated landscapes are gentler environments. The chemical effects of plant expansion are just as important. Roots interact with soil minerals, accelerating weathering processes that influence nutrient availability and carbon cycling. Organic matter accumulates in soils, altering their structure and water-holding capacity. During the Carnian, as plant matter built up on floodplains and lands, Soils became richer and more complex. This supported further plant growth and increased biological activity below ground. Life above and below the surface began to intertwine more closely. The greening of the world did not happen overnight. It unfolded over thousands of generations, with plant communities advancing, retreating, and reassembling in response to local conditions. Some regions became wetter sooner than others. Some retained dry characteristics longer, but the overall trend was clear. A planet that had been constrained by water scarcity was becoming increasingly shaped by biological processes. It is worth noting that this expansion was not without tension. Plants adapted to dry conditions did not vanish immediately. They competed with newcomers. Some retreated to higher ground or more marginal areas. Others persisted alongside moisture-loving species in mixed communities. Evolution responded accordingly. Traits that supported growth in wetter environments became more advantageous. Over time, this influenced which plant lineages thrived and which declined. The visual transformation of the landscape would have been subtle to any single generation of organisms living through it. But over millions of years, the difference would have been unmistakable. Valleys once lined with sparse shrubs became corridors of greenery. Seasonal colour gave way to more consistent cover. The world was not becoming a jungle, but it was becoming alive in new ways. By spreading across the land, plants altered how energy, water, and nutrients moved through the Earth system. They softened the extremes of climate, stabilized surfaces, and fed back into the very processes that had allowed them to flourish. In this sense, vegetation was not merely a passenger during the Carnian Pluvial episode. It was an active participant. The rain opened the door. Plants stepped through it, and as green spread across Pangaea, it marked a shift not just in appearance, but in how the planet functioned. Life was no longer confined to narrow refuges. It was beginning to shape the environment on a continental scale, quietly preparing the ground for the biological changes that would follow. As the land grew wetter and greener, not all life benefited equally. While new ecosystems took shape, others began to unravel. The Carnian Pluvial episode was not a story of universal flourishing. It was also a period of loss, adjustment, and quiet collapse for communities that had been finely tuned to a dry world. Dry adapted species are specialists. They evolved to survive scarcity, not abundance. Traits that help organisms conserve water, tolerate heat, and endure long intervals without rain can become liabilities when moisture becomes constant. During the Carnian, this mismatch between adaptation and environment reshaped ecosystems from the ground up. Many plants that thrived under arid conditions depended on open ground, intense sunlight, and soils that drained quickly. When rainfall increased and vegetation spread, those open spaces began to close. Taller plants shaded smaller ones. Persistent moisture altered soil chemistry. Fungal growth increased. Seeds adapted to dry, exposed conditions struggled to germinate in damp, crowded environments. Animals faced similar challenges. Reptiles and other terrestrial animals adapted to dry climates often relied on specific temperature ranges and nesting conditions. Eggs laid in dry soils could fail in saturated ground. Burrows collapsed. Parching habitats disappeared beneath expanding floodplains and wetlands. Even slight changes in moisture could disrupt feeding patterns. Herbivores dependent on sparse drought-tolerant vegetation found their food replaced by unfamiliar plant types. Predators following those herbivores were forced to adapt or move. One of the most disruptive factors was habitat instability. Flooding became more frequent as rivers expanded and overflowed their banks. Areas that had once been seasonally dry now experienced repeated inundation. Soil that had remained firm for long periods softened, slumped, or eroded. Stable nesting grounds, burrowing sites, and shelter locations vanished. In some regions, entire landscapes became transitional zones, neither fully dry nor permanently wet, but constantly shifting between states. Species adapted to predictability struggled to cope with this new variability. The fossil record preserves evidence of this disruption through changes in species composition over time. Paleontologists track what is known as fossil turnover, the rate at which species appear and disappear within successive layers of rock. During the Carnian interval, turnover rates increase noticeably in several groups, particularly among plants, marine invertebrates, and terrestrial vertebrates. This does not indicate a single catastrophic extinction event. Instead, it points to a prolonged period of ecological stress, during which some species declined and vanished, while others emerged or expanded. Extinction in this context was selective. Many lineages survived, some even thrived. But the balance shifted. Species tightly bound to dry conditions faced sustained pressure that they could not escape. Those with broader tolerances, greater mobility, or flexible diets were more likely to persist. This selectivity is one of the defining features of climate-driven extinction. It does not wipe the slate clean. It rearranges it. In marine environments, similar patterns appeared. Increased rainfall altered freshwater runoff into coastal seas, changing salinity and nutrient levels. This affected plankton communities which sit at the base of marine food webs. Shifts at that level propagated upward, influencing which species could thrive. On land, plant turnover reshaped entire food chains. As certain plant groups declined and others spread, herbivores were forced to adapt or disappear. Insects dependent on specific plants followed similar trajectories. Ecosystems reorganized themselves around the new dominant vegetation. Importantly, these changes unfolded gradually. There was no single moment when ecosystems collapsed. Instead, they thinned, fragmented, and transformed over hundreds of thousands of years. Some species lingered in shrinking refuges before finally disappearing. Others survived by retreating to higher ground or more marginal environments where conditions remained closer to their original niche. This gradual loss is easy to overlook, but it is central to understanding the Carnian Pluvial episode. The event did not erase life. It reshuffled it. Scientists studying late Triassic fossils often describe this interval as one of ecological turnover rather than mass extinction. The distinction matters. Mass extinctions are defined by the rapid loss of a large percentage of species across many groups. The Carnian interval shows something different, a drawn-out reorganization driven by sustained environmental change. That reorganization cleared space. As older ecosystems weakened, new ones found room to develop. Resources once locked into established relationships became available. Competition patterns shifted. Evolutionary experiments that had previously failed gained a foothold. From a distance, this might look like progress. From the perspective of the organisms living through it, it was disruption. There is a tendency to frame extinction as dramatic and final. But most extinctions are quieter than that. They involve declining populations, shrinking ranges, and missed reproductive opportunities rather than sudden disappearance. The Carnian Pluvial episode exemplifies this quieter mode of loss. It also highlights the vulnerability of specialists. Species adapted to narrow environmental windows perform exceptionally well within those limits. But when conditions move steadily outside that window and remain there, even the most refined adaptations offer little protection. Flexibility becomes more valuable than optimization. This pattern appears again and again in Earth's history, not just during the Carnian. Climate change rewards generalists and punishes specialists. It favors mobility, tolerance, and innovation. By the end of the Carnian interval, the biological landscape had been altered in lasting ways. Many dry-adapted lineages were reduced or gone. Others survived only in limited pockets. In their place, communities better suited to wetter, more variable conditions expanded. The result was not a wasteland. It was a transition. Ecosystems did not vanish. They transformed. Old relationships loosened, new ones formed. The structure of life on land and in the sea shifted toward a different balance. This reshuffling set the stage for future dominance by groups that could exploit the altered environment. It removed constraints that had held certain lineages back and created openings that would soon be filled. Loss and opportunity arrived together. The Carnian Pluvial episode reminds scientists that ecological change is rarely one-sided. Flourishing in one corner often coincides with collapse in another. Understanding this balance is essential for appreciating how life responds to sustained environmental pressure. The rain did not simply nourish. It tested, and in that test, the old order bent, cracked, and gradually gave way, allowing a new arrangement of life to take shape on a planet that was learning slowly and relentlessly how to be wet. As older ecosystems weakened and some species faded, space began to open. In nature, loss is rarely left unfilled for long. When conditions change, the first response is disruption. The second is opportunity. During the Carnian Pluvial episode, that opportunity arrived quietly, carried by water, warmth, and time. Wetter environments do more than support existing life. They create new places to live. Rain transforms landscapes into mosaics, rivers carve channels and leave behind floodplains. Wetlands form in low-lying areas. Forest edges appear where open ground once dominated. Each of these environments offers different resources, different risks, and different possibilities. The result is a rapid increase in ecological niches, distinct ways of making a living within the same broad landscape. In a dry world, options are limited. In a wetter one, variety multiplies. Standing water supports organisms that could not survive desiccation. Damp soils allow burrowing species to thrive. Dense vegetation creates shaded microclimates with cooler temperatures and higher humidity. Even small variations in moisture and plant cover can support entirely different communities side by side. This diversification of habitat sets the stage for diversification of life. Insects were among the first to respond. They reproduce quickly, adapt rapidly, and exploit fine-scale environmental differences. As plant communities expanded and changed, insects followed. New leaves, stems, and reproductive structures provided food and shelter. Pollination, spore dispersal, and herbivory became more complex as plant diversity increased. Fossil evidence from the Late Triassic suggests a noticeable increase in insect diversity during this interval. While insects rarely fossilize well, traces such as feeding marks on leaves, burrows in soil, and rare preserved specimens point toward expanding populations and new behaviors. Amphibians also benefited from wetter conditions. Amphibians depend on moisture for reproduction and skin respiration. In dry climates, their range and abundance are tightly constrained. The Carnian rains expanded shallow water habitats, seasonal ponds, and humid refuges, allowing amphibians to spread into areas previously inaccessible to them. With that expansion came experimentation. Different body sizes, feeding strategies, and life cycles appeared. Some species specialized in aquatic environments, while others exploited the margins between water and land. These boundary zones are often rich in resources and relatively free from competition, making them ideal arenas for evolutionary innovation. Early reptiles, too, began exploring new possibilities. Reptiles are often associated with dry conditions because of their shelled eggs and scaly skin. But many early reptile groups were more flexible than that reputation suggests. With increased moisture and vegetation, new food sources became available. Insects multiplied. Small vertebrates diversified. Shelter became easier to find. Some reptiles began experimenting with upright postures, longer limbs, and more efficient movement. These traits are not solely responses to wet conditions, but wetter environments made them more advantageous by supporting sustained activity and wider foraging ranges. This period of change fits neatly within a broader evolutionary concept known as adaptive radiation. Adaptive radiation occurs when a group of organisms rapidly diversifies to fill newly available ecological roles. It is most often triggered by environmental change, the removal of competitors, or the appearance of new resources. The Carnian Pluvial episode provided all three. As dry adapted species declined, competition loosened. As habitats diversified, new roles emerged. As vegetation and insect life expanded, energy flowed through ecosystems in new ways. Together, these factors encouraged lineages to branch, experiment, and spread. It is important to note that adaptive radiation does not imply immediate success. many evolutionary experiments fail. Traits that appear promising in one context may prove disadvantageous in another. But periods of environmental instability increase the rate of experimentation simply because the usual constraints have been disrupted. Stable environments reward refinement. Changing environments reward flexibility. During the Carnian, instability was not chaotic but persistent. Conditions did not swing wildly back and forth, they shifted and stayed shifted. This gave organisms time to respond, but also ensured that old solutions no longer worked as well as they once had. In evolutionary terms, this is fertile ground. Lineages that could tolerate a range of conditions or move between habitats were more likely to persist. Those that could exploit transitional environments such as floodplains or forest edges found abundant opportunity. Traits supporting endurance, mobility, and generalist feeding became increasingly valuable. Over thousands of generations, these pressures shaped populations in subtle but lasting ways. It is also during this interval that early dinosaur relatives began to quietly benefit, though they were far from dominant at this stage. Small, lightly built, and relatively rare, these animals occupied niches alongside many other reptile groups. Their eventual success was not guaranteed, but the Carnian environment began to favour some of their key traits. Upright posture allowed efficient movement across varied terrain. Lightweight skeletons supported sustained activity. A flexible diet reduced dependence on any single food source. None of these traits evolved for rain, but rain made them useful. The important point is that dinosaurs did not rise because the Carnian Pluvial episode cleared the board entirely. They rose because it changed the rules. Environmental instability accelerates evolutionary change not by forcing constant crisis, but by preventing long-term equilibrium. When conditions remain in flux, even slowly, populations are pushed to explore new solutions. Genetic variation that might remain neutral or disadvantageous in a stable world can become beneficial. This process is well documented in evolutionary biology and observed across many periods of Earth's history. The Carnian stands out because of its duration. 2 million years is long enough for evolutionary experiments to be tested repeatedly, refined or discarded. Some lineages expanded and diversified, others tried and failed. The fossil record captures this uneven progress as a patchwork of appearances, disappearances, and transformations. Importantly, opportunity did not arrive evenly. Regions differed in how quickly they became wet, how much vegetation developed, and how stable conditions remained. This geographic variation further encouraged diversification as populations adapted to local conditions and diverged from one another. What emerged was not a single new ecosystem but many. Wetlands, forests, river margins, uplands, and transitional zones each hosted different communities. Movement between these environments exposed organisms to new selective pressures, accelerating adaptation and divergence. From a distance, this might look like growth. From within the system, it was exploration. Life was testing boundaries, probing new ways of living, responding to a world that no longer behaved as it once had. The collapse of old ecosystems had not left emptiness. It had created space for new interactions, space for new strategies, space for lineages that had previously remained in the background. The Carnian Pluvial episode did not crown winners immediately. It set conditions that allowed certain traits to gain traction over long spans of time. It encouraged adaptability over specialization, resilience over optimization. By the end of this interval, the biological landscape was more complex, more interconnected, and more dynamic than before. The groundwork had been laid for shifts that would become clearer later when the climate eventually stabilized and competition intensified again. Opportunity, once opened, does not announce its beneficiaries right away. It works slowly, quietly, shaping the future through countless small successes and failures until one path among many tested begins to stand out. By the time the Carnian rains had reshaped landscapes and rearranged ecosystems, a group of animals often imagined as rulers of this era were in reality barely noticeable. Dinosaurs existed, but they did not dominate. They were present, persistent, and largely unremarkable, waiting in the ecological margins. While other reptiles still held center stage, early dinosaurs were small, lightly built creatures. Many were no larger than a medium-sized dog, and some were smaller still. They lived alongside a diverse array of reptilian competitors, including crocodile relatives, large herbivorous reptiles, and formidable predators that bore little resemblance to the dinosaurs that would later become famous. In the Carnian world, dinosaurs were one option among many. Their ecological positions reflected this. Early dinosaurs occupied modest niches, often as agile predators of small animals or as lightly built herbivores browsing low vegetation. They did not monopolize resources. They did not dominate food webs. They were outnumbered and overshadowed by other groups that had been established far longer. What they did possess, however, were a handful of traits that quietly suited the changing conditions. One of the most important was posture. Unlike many sprawling reptiles of the time, early dinosaurs walked with limbs positioned more directly beneath their bodies. This upright stance allowed for more efficient movement, particularly over long distances. Energy was spent propelling the body forward rather than sideways, reducing fatigue and increasing endurance. In a dry world, this advantage might have been marginal. In a wetter one, it mattered more. As rain expanded river networks and vegetation, landscapes became more varied and often more challenging to traverse. Soft soils, uneven floodplains, and dense plant cover favoured animals capable of sustained, controlled movement. An upright posture allowed early dinosaurs to travel efficiently between feeding grounds, nesting sites, and refuges without exhausting themselves. Endurance became increasingly valuable. Wetter climates also meant higher productivity. More plants supported more insects and small vertebrates, creating a richer but more competitive food web. For small predators, the ability to forage widely and persistently was an advantage. Early dinosaurs were not necessarily faster than their competitors in short bursts, but they could often keep moving for longer. This combination of efficiency and stamina did not make them superior in every context, but it made them adaptable. Fossil discoveries from late Triassic rocks provide glimpses of these early forms. Skeletons attributed to early dinosaur groups appear sporadically in Carnian age deposits, often alongside a wide variety of other reptile fossils. They're rarely abundant, rarely large, and rarely dominant. These fossils tell a story of persistence rather than triumph. The bones show animals well suited to movement with long hind limbs, lightweight frames, and joints that favoured a narrow range of motion aligned with forward travel. Teeth suggest varied diets from insect eating to small prey, reflecting flexibility rather than specialisation. Importantly, these fossils appear in environments shaped by the Carnian rains. Floodplains, river margins, and vegetated lands provided complex habitats where mobility and endurance were useful traits. Early dinosaurs were not exploiting some entirely new niche. They were fitting into a landscape that had become more forgiving to their way of moving. It is tempting to view this moment as the beginning of dinosaur inevitability, but that would be misleading. At this stage, dinosaurs were not guaranteed future success. Many other reptile groups possessed their own advantages. Some were larger, some were better armoured, some were better suited to aquatic or semi-aquatic environments that expanded during the wet interval. Dinosaurs coexisted with these groups for millions of years without displacing them. The key difference lies in how these groups responded to change. Dinosaurs, with their efficient locomotion and flexible diets, were well positioned to persist through environmental variability. They did not require extremely specific conditions. They could operate across a range of habitats without excelling in any single one. This generalist tendency often proves advantageous during periods of instability. The Carnian environment rewarded organisms that could tolerate variation. Rainfall was more consistent, but landscapes were still shifting. Rivers migrated. Floodplains expanded and contracted. Vegetation changed composition over time. Animals that could adjust without needing precise conditions were more likely to endure. Dinosaurs fit this description, but so did others. That is why patience matters in this story. The Carnian Pluvial episode did not elevate dinosaurs overnight. It did not wipe out their competitors and hand them dominance. Instead, it created conditions that allowed dinosaurs to remain present, adaptable, and resilient. While ecosystems around them reorganized, they survived not because they were superior, but because they were sufficient. This distinction is important. Evolution does not select for greatness. It selects for persistence. Traits that allow survival across changing conditions are often more valuable than traits that offer short-term advantage in a narrow context. Early dinosaurs were persistent. They endured the wet interval without needing radical reinvention. They occupied modest niches and continued to reproduce. While other groups rose and fell around them, dinosaurs remained part of the background fauna, neither flourishing nor collapsing. This long period of relative obscurity is easy to overlook because it lacks drama. Yet, it was essential. It allowed dinosaur lineages to accumulate diversity quietly, exploring different body plans and behaviors without intense competition for dominance. By the end of the Carnian, dinosaurs were still not rulers of the land, but they had survived a major climatic upheaval that reshaped ecosystems worldwide. Many other groups did not fare as well. In evolutionary terms, survival through disruption is a powerful filter. It is also worth remembering that the dinosaurs of the Carnian would not have recognized themselves as a destined lineage. They were simply animals navigating a changing world, responding to opportunities and constraints as they arose. Their future dominance was not written into the rain. It was made possible by it. The Carnian Pluvial episode created a landscape where endurance, flexibility, and efficient movement were useful traits. Dinosaurs happened to possess these traits early. They benefited quietly, without spectacle, without fanfare. They waited, not passively, but persistently, occupying space, testing strategies, and remaining available to future opportunity. When conditions later shifted again, and competition reshaped itself once more, those waiting lineages would find themselves better positioned than many of their rivals. For now, though, they remained in the wings. Small, unassuming, present. In a world still defined by transition rather than dominance, dinosaurs were not yet the stars of the story. They were simply among those who had learned patiently how to last. Nothing about the Carnian reign suggested a dramatic finale. There was no single year when clouds suddenly cleared everywhere, no moment when rivers retreated overnight and deserts returned. Instead, the long wet interval eased its grip slowly, almost reluctantly, as the forces that had sustained it began to weaken. The end of the pluvial period was not an event. It was a process. At the heart of that process was a change deep within the Earth. The volcanic activity that had driven the climate shift did not stop abruptly, but it did diminish. Large igneous provinces like Rangelia are defined by prolonged outpourings of lava. Yet even these immense systems eventually lose momentum. Magma supply declines, fractures in the crust seal, eruptions become less frequent. As volcanic output decreased, the steady addition of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere slowed. The tap that had been feeding the greenhouse effect was no longer fully open. This did not reverse warming immediately, but it altered the balance between input and removal. For the first time in millions of years, Earth's natural carbon sinks had a chance to catch up. Chemical weathering continued to draw carbon dioxide out of the air. Rainwater still interacted with rock, locking carbon into minerals and transporting it toward the oceans. Plants now widespread across much of Pangaea continued to absorb carbon during growth and store it in biomass and soils. These processes had always been operating. What changed was the context. With volcanic emissions reduced, removal mechanisms began to gain ground. Atmospheric recovery was slow, measured not in generations, but in geological patience. Carbon dioxide concentrations declined gradually. Temperatures eased by small increments. The atmosphere became slightly less efficient at holding moisture. Rainfall did not vanish, it softened. Regions that had experienced near-continuous wet conditions began to see longer dry intervals return. Wet seasons shortened. Rivers still flowed, but with less constancy. Floodplains remained, yet floods became less frequent and less expansive. Weather patterns stabilized, not by snapping back to an earlier state, but by settling into a new equilibrium. The rock record captures this transition with subtlety rather than drama. Stratigraphic layers show a gradual return of features associated with drier conditions. Red beds reappear in some regions, indicating renewed exposure of sediments to oxygen. Evaporite deposits begin to form again in basins where water periodically evaporated faster than it was replenished. Coal layers become less common. Floodplain mudstones thin or give way to siltier deposits. River channels become more confined, cutting deeper rather than wandering broadly across the landscape. These changes do not occur all at once, nor do they appear identically everywhere. Some regions dried earlier than others. Local geography, elevation, and proximity to water all influenced how quickly conditions shifted. This unevenness reinforces an important point. Climate change in deep time is rarely uniform. It unfolds as a patchwork with different areas responding at different rates. The end of the Carnian Pluvial episode was no exception. What ties these regional stories together is direction rather than synchrony. Across Pangaea, the overall trend moved away from sustained wetness and toward greater variability. Rainfall became something that arrived and departed again, rather than remaining as a near-constant background condition. The concept of gradualism is essential here. There is a natural tendency to imagine climate episodes as having clear beginnings and endings like chapters with neat boundaries. In reality, the boundaries are blurred. The Carnian Pluvial episode faded not because it was abruptly terminated, but because the conditions that sustained it slowly relaxed. This gradual decline had important consequences for life. Ecosystems that had reorganized around persistent moisture were given time to adjust. Plants did not suddenly face drought. Animals did not experience instant habitat collapse. Instead, selection pressures shifted slowly, favoring traits that could cope with increasing seasonality and variability. Some wet-adapted species retreated to refuges where moisture remained reliable. Others adapted to tolerate drier intervals. Still, others declined as conditions moved beyond their optimal range. Because the change was slow, extinction rates did not spike dramatically at the end of the pluvial period. The ecological reshuffling continued, but without the sharp losses that often accompany abrupt environmental shifts. From a climate perspective, this slow resolution highlights the inertia of Earth's systems. Once the atmosphere and oceans had warmed, they did not cool quickly. Heat stored in the oceans was released gradually. Soils and vegetation continued to influence local climate long after rainfall began to decrease. Feedbacks that had once supported wetness unwound at their own pace. Even the hydrological cycle adjusted cautiously. Evaporation declined as temperatures eased, but clouds and rainfall patterns took time to reorganize. The sky did not simply clear. It learned slowly how to behave differently. By the time the Carnian interval fully gave way to more typical late Triassic conditions, the planet had been fundamentally altered. River systems remained more developed than before. Soils were deeper and more complex. Vegetation patterns had shifted permanently. In that sense, the rain never truly ended. Its legacy remained etched into the landscape and into the biological trajectories set in motion during the wet years. Scientists studying these transitions emphasize this continuity. The end of the Carnian Pluvial episode is marked not by a sharp line, but by a gradual change in probabilities. Wet conditions became less likely. Dry intervals became more common. Extremes softened into patterns. This matters because it reframes how climatic episodes are understood. The Carnian rain was not a temporary disturbance that left the system unchanged once it passed. It was a restructuring phase. When it eased, the world did not return to what it had been before. It moved forward, carrying the imprint of what had occurred. There is something quietly instructive about this ending. It shows that climate does not require decisive endings to move on. It drifts, it adjusts, it transitions. And in doing so, it gives life time to respond, adapt, and reposition itself. The long rain did not stop with a final storm. It thinned, it softened, it withdrew step by step, and as it did, the planet emerged, not restored, but transformed, ready for the next chapter of its history to unfold under skies that were no longer endlessly wet, yet never quite the same again. When the long rain finally loosened its hold, the world did not reset. The Carnian Pluvial episode left behind a planet that carried its history forward, etched into landscapes, soils, and living systems. What followed was not a return to an earlier state, but the settling of a changed Earth into a new normal. One of the most enduring legacies lay in the shape of the land itself. River basins that had expanded during the wet interval did not simply disappear when rainfall eased. Channels carved deeper paths, valleys widened, floodplains left behind thick blankets of fine sediment. Even as flow became more seasonal again, these structures guided where water would travel in the future. Drainage networks were more integrated than before, linking distant regions through established pathways. This mattered because rivers influence far more than water movement. They shape erosion patterns, transport nutrients, and determine where life concentrates. By reorganizing river basins, the Carnian rains permanently altered how energy and material moved across Pangaea. Soils tell a similar story of persistence. Before the rains, many soils were thin, compacted, and chemically simple, shaped by long periods of dryness. During the wet interval, sustained moisture transformed them. Weathering penetrated deeper, organic matter accumulated. Clay minerals formed and reorganized, increasing the ability of soils to hold water and nutrients. Even as conditions dried somewhat, these more complex soils remained. They did not revert to their earlier state overnight. Deeper profiles continued to influence root growth, groundwater storage, and surface stability. In many regions, the land retained a memory of moisture long after rainfall patterns shifted. Vegetation patterns too showed lasting change. Some plant communities that expanded during the Carnian retreated as the climate became less consistently wet. Others persisted, especially along rivers, in lowlands, and in regions where soils now retained moisture more effectively. Forested corridors remained where none had existed before. Open woodlands replaced sparse shrublands in places that had crossed a threshold of productivity. The result was a patchier, more varied landscape than the one that preceded the rains. Instead of vast expanses defined primarily by dryness, the land became a mosaic of habitats shaped by local conditions and inherited structure. These vegetation patterns influence climate in subtle but enduring ways. Plants regulate temperature, moisture, and chemistry at the surface. Shaded ground heats differently than bare soil. Transpiration returns water to the atmosphere. Organic matter alters how nutrients move through ecosystems. By changing plant distribution, the Carnian Pluvial episode adjusted these surface processes in ways that continued to matter long after the rains eased. Nutrient cycles were among the most profoundly altered systems. Increased weathering during the wet interval released large quantities of minerals such as phosphorus and calcium from rock. Rivers transported these nutrients into lands and coastal environments, enriching soils and sediments. Biological productivity increased not just on land, but in nearshore marine settings influenced by runoff. Once established, these enriched systems did not simply flush away. Nutrients became incorporated into soils, biomass, and sedimentary deposits. Even as erosion rates declined, the baseline availability of key elements remained higher than before in many regions. This shift influenced which plants could thrive, which herbivores could be supported, and how energy flowed through food webs. Nutrient-rich systems tend to support greater complexity and tighter biological interactions. In that sense, the Carnian rains raised the ceiling on ecological possibility. Earth system science provides a useful framework for understanding why these changes endured. Earth systems are interconnected networks linking atmosphere, hydrosphere, lithosphere, and biosphere. A sustained change in one component often propagates through the others, producing outcomes that cannot be undone simply by reversing the original trigger. The Carnian Pluvial episode altered atmospheric composition, which changed rainfall. Rainfall reshaped landscapes. Landscapes influenced vegetation. Vegetation modified soils and nutrient cycles. Each step reinforced the next, embedding change across multiple layers of the system. Once these connections were established, returning to a pre-Carnian state would have required reversing all of them simultaneously. That did not happen. Instead, the system found a new balance. This is why the concept of irreversibility matters here. Irreversible does not mean permanent in an absolute sense. Over tens of millions of years, continents drift, climates evolve, and life continues to transform. But on the scale relevant to the Late Triassic, the Carnian changes set conditions that persisted long enough to redirect evolutionary and environmental trajectories. The planet that emerged after the rains was not wetter forever, but it was different forever. Even subtle shifts can have outsized effects over time. A slightly deeper soil allows different plants to establish. Those plants support different insects. Insects support different predators. Predators influence population dynamics over thousands of generations. These small differences compound. Geographers and geologists often speak of landscapes having memory. Once a river carves a valley, water tends to return there. Once a soil profile develops, it shapes what can grow. Once a nutrient cycle intensifies, it alters productivity. The Carnian Pluvial episode wrote a new memory into Earth's surface. From a biological perspective, this memory mattered enormously. Species evolving after the Carnian did so in a world whose baseline conditions had shifted. The competitive landscape they entered was not the one that had existed before the rains. It was richer, more connected, and more dynamic. This does not mean that life improved in any moral sense. It means that the parameters of survival changed. There's a quiet lesson here about scale. From the perspective of a single organism, the Carnian rains would have felt like weather. From the perspective of ecosystems, they were pressure. From the perspective of Earth systems, they were reorganization. Understanding this layered impact helps explain why the aftermath of the pluvial period cannot be reduced to a simple return to normal. Normal had been redefined. Even as volcanic emissions declined and rainfall patterns stabilized, the planet continued operating under conditions shaped by what had happened. Rivers followed new paths, soils retained new properties, vegetation occupied new ground, nutrients circulated differently, change had been absorbed. This is why Earth system scientists emphasize thresholds and legacies. When a system crosses certain points, it does not easily retrace its steps. Feedbacks lock in new behaviors. The cost of reversal grows with time. The Carnian Pluvial episode crossed several such thresholds. It transformed arid interiors into regions capable of supporting continuous vegetation. It linked distant landscapes through river networks. It intensified biological cycling of carbon and nutrients. These were not temporary overlays, they became structural features of the planet. From this altered foundation, future changes would unfold. Later climatic shifts, tectonic movements, and evolutionary events all played out on a stage that had been subtly rearranged by 2 million years of rain. The world that would eventually belong to dinosaurs was already being shaped long before they rose to prominence. In that sense, the Carnian Pluvial episode did not end when the rain eased. It concluded as an active phase, but it remained present as context. The planet carried on, not by forgetting what had happened, but by building upon it. A changed Earth does not announce itself. It simply behaves differently, quietly, consistently, as new patterns replace old ones. And long after the clouds thinned, the legacy of that ancient rain continued to guide the flow of water, the growth of plants, and the pathways of life across a world that could never quite return to being dry again. As the climate settled into a more stable pattern, the biological consequences of the long rain began to clarify. The Carnian Pluvial episode was over as an active force, but its legacy shaped every landscape dinosaurs now moved through. The world they inherited was not simply wetter or drier, it was reorganized. This mattered deeply. Dinosaurs did not rise during the rain itself. They rose afterward in the quieter interval, when conditions stopped shifting so dramatically and began to hold steady. Stability, after prolonged disruption, can be just as powerful an evolutionary force as change. It allows advantages that were once subtle to compound. The post-Carnian world offered exactly that. River systems remained established even as rainfall became more seasonal. Vegetation persisted in corridors and lowlands, providing reliable food sources. Soils were deeper and more productive than before. Nutrient cycling was more active. Ecosystems were complex but no longer constantly reorganizing. For dinosaurs, this combination was favorable. Their traits had allowed them to persist through instability. Now those same traits became tools for expansion. Upright posture, efficient movement, and flexible diets were no longer just survival strategies. They became competitive advantages in a world where resources were spread across broader connected landscapes. Dinosaurs could travel efficiently between feeding areas. They could exploit patchy environments without exhausting themselves. They could remain active for longer periods, even when conditions varied across seasons. Importantly, they were already present. Evolution rarely rewards newcomers instantly. It favors lineages that are already embedded in ecosystems when opportunity arises. Dinosaurs did not need to evolve entirely new body plans to take advantage of post-Carnian conditions. They only needed time as climate stabilized. Competition intensified. Other reptile groups that had survived the wet interval were still present. Crocodile relatives, large herbivorous reptiles, and diverse predatory forms continued to occupy many ecological roles. Dinosaurs did not immediately displace them. Instead, competition played out gradually through differences in efficiency, reproduction, and resilience. Some reptile groups remained highly specialized. They performed exceptionally well within narrow ecological windows, but struggled when conditions shifted even slightly. Dinosaurs, by contrast, tended to tolerate a wider range of environments. This did not make them superior in every encounter, but it made them harder to exclude. Over thousands of generations, small differences matter. Slightly higher endurance allows wider foraging. Slightly faster growth rates allow earlier reproduction. Slightly greater flexibility in diet reduces vulnerability to local shortages. None of these traits guaranteed dominance on their own, but together they tilt the balance. Evolutionary biologists describe this process not as conquest, but as accumulation. Dinosaurs accumulated territory, diversity, and numbers slowly. They expanded into niches that had opened during the Carnian disruptions, and then remained open as ecosystems stabilized. In some cases, they displaced older groups directly. In others, they occupied adjacent roles, reducing competition through differentiation rather than exclusion. This pattern is consistent with broader principles in evolutionary biology. After periods of environmental upheaval, dominance often emerges not from sudden superiority, but from persistence through the disruption followed by expansion during recovery. The Carnian Pluvial episode acted as a filter. It removed some competitors. It weakened others. It reshaped habitats in ways that favored mobility, endurance, and flexibility. Dinosaurs passed through that filter intact. When conditions later allowed populations to grow and diversify, they were well positioned to respond. It is crucial to avoid framing this outcome as inevitable. Dinosaurs did not rise because they were destined to rule. They rose because circumstances aligned with their existing traits. Had the climate stabilized differently, had other groups possessed similar combinations of traits, the outcome could have diverged. The fossil record preserves many successful reptile lineages that never became dominant. Not because they were inferior, but because opportunity did not favor them in the same way. What the Carnian aftermath provided was time. Time for dinosaur populations to grow without constant disruption. Time for lineages to diversify into herbivores, carnivores, and omnivores. Time for body sizes to increase gradually as food webs supported larger animals. As forests and floodplains matured, they supported more biomass. Larger herbivores became viable. Larger predators followed. Dinosaurs participated in this expansion alongside other groups at first, but over time their representation increased. This shift is visible in the fossil record as a gradual rise in dinosaur abundance and diversity after the Carnian. Early dinosaurs become more common in sediments dating to the later Triassic. Their footprints appear more frequently. Their skeletal remains diversify. Still, this was not a sudden takeover. For millions of years, dinosaurs shared ecosystems with competitors that continued to thrive in their own niches. The difference was trajectory. Dinosaur diversity trended upward, while some competing groups plateaued or declined. This divergence reflects how ecosystems respond to earlier disruption. Groups that benefit most from post-disturbance conditions are not necessarily those that thrived during the disturbance itself. They are those whose traits align best with the new baseline. The Carnian rains had raised that baseline. Soils were richer, landscapes were more connected, vegetation was more continuous. These conditions favoured animals capable of sustained movement, flexible feeding, and efficient reproduction. Dinosaurs fit this profile well. It is also worth noting that dinosaur success unfolded unevenly across regions. Some areas saw earlier expansion, others retained strongholds of non-dinosaurian reptiles for longer periods. This geographic variability further undermines any notion of inevitability. Local conditions mattered, chance mattered, timing mattered. What unites these regional stories is not dominance itself, but the pathway toward it. Dinosaurs did not leap into power, they grew into it. They did so on a planet already altered by 2 million years of rain, erosion, vegetation growth, and ecological reshuffling. The world they inhabited after the Carnian was more forgiving in some ways, more competitive in others. It rewarded endurance and adaptability rather than specialization alone. This is the quiet significance of the aftermath. The Carnian Pluvial episode did not create dinosaurs. It did not crown them. It prepared a world in which their particular combination of traits could matter more than before. Once the climate stabilized, those traits began to pay dividends by persisting through disruption and then expanding during recovery. Dinosaurs followed a pattern seen repeatedly in Earth's history. Survival through change opens the door. Stability allows passage through it. In that sense, dinosaur dominance was not written in the rain itself, but in what the rain left behind. A connected landscape, a restructured ecosystem, a planet ready to reward those who could move efficiently through it, endure its variability, and take advantage of opportunities that unfolded slowly. Dinosaurs were not alone in doing this. They were simply among those who did it best long after the clouds had thinned and the long wet chapter had quietly come to an end. When scientists look back at the Carnian Pluvial episode, they are not searching for warnings or parables. They are studying a case, a long, well-preserved example of how Earth responds when its climate is pushed gently, persistently, and for a very long time. Deep time offers a perspective that short records cannot. One of the clearest lessons from the Carnian is that pace and magnitude are not the same thing. Climate change does not need to be fast to be transformative. The Carnian rains did not arrive as a sudden shock. Temperatures rose gradually, rainfall increased incrementally, yet over 2 million years, the cumulative effect reshaped landscapes, ecosystems, and evolutionary trajectories. From a physical standpoint, the magnitude of change was modest. There's no evidence for runaway heating or extreme global temperature spikes. What mattered was persistence. The system was nudged in one direction and held there long enough for slow processes to respond fully. This distinction is crucial for understanding Earth's behaviour. Fast changes often draw attention because they are disruptive on short timescales. Slow changes can be more powerful precisely because they allow feedbacks to engage. Soils adjust, vegetation reorganizes, rivers carve new paths. Biological communities reshuffle. Given enough time, even small imbalances can produce large outcomes. Duration matters as much as intensity. The Carnian Pluvial episode demonstrates this repeatedly. Rainfall that might have been manageable over a few centuries became transformative when sustained over millions of years. Ecosystems did not simply weather the change. They adapted to it, then evolved within it. In climate science, This is often described in terms of thresholds and response times. Different components of the Earth system respond on different schedules. The atmosphere reacts quickly. Oceans respond more slowly. Ice sheets, soils, and biological systems operate on even longer timescales. During the Carnian, volcanic emissions altered atmospheric composition relatively quickly in geological terms. The hydrological cycle responded next. Landscapes followed. Biological systems responded last, but most deeply. This staggered response helps explain why the effects of climate change can continue long after the original driver weakens. By the time volcanic output declined, the system had already reorganized itself around a wetter state. Undoing that reorganization required far more than simply removing the initial cause. Modern climate scientists use this understanding to build models that explore how Earth systems interact across time. These models incorporate physics, chemistry, biology, and geology, allowing researchers to simulate how changes propagate through the planet. When these models are applied to deep time events like the Carnian, they are not expected to reproduce every detail. Instead, they are used to test whether known physical principles can generate patterns consistent with the geological record. In the case of the Carnian Pluvial episode, models that include sustained volcanic carbon input, greenhouse warming, and hydrological feedback successfully reproduce key features seen in the rocks: increased rainfall, expanded river networks, enhanced weathering. These results strengthen confidence that the underlying mechanisms are well understood, even if the precise values remain uncertain. Uncertainty is not a flaw in this process. It is a feature. Deep-time climate science operates with incomplete information by necessity. No thermometer measured Triassic temperatures. No rain gauge recorded Carnian precipitation. Scientists infer conditions indirectly using proxies preserved in rock and fossil records. Each proxy carries limitations. Each interpretation has margins of error. Progress comes not from eliminating uncertainty, but from narrowing it through convergence of evidence. The Carnian Pluvial episode illustrates the value of that convergence. Sediments, isotopes, fossils, and models all point toward the same general story. A prolonged increase in greenhouse gases led to sustained warming and rainfall. The details vary by region and method, but the overall pattern holds. This encourages a posture of scientific humility. Earth's climate is not a simple machine. It is a network of interacting systems with non-linear behavior. Small inputs can have large effects under certain conditions. Large inputs can be buffered or delayed under others. Predicting exact outcomes is difficult, especially across long time scales. What deep time events offer is not certainty, but context. They show what kinds of changes are possible. They reveal which processes tend to amplify change and which tend to dampen it. They highlight the importance of feedbacks, thresholds, and persistence. They also remind scientists that climate change is not inherently dramatic. Some of the most influential shifts in Earth's history occurred quietly without spectacle. They unfolded through consistency rather than extremes. Another lesson from the Carnian is that climate change rarely acts alone. It interacts with tectonics, geography, and biology. The supercontinent Pangaea shaped atmospheric circulation. Vegetation influenced rainfall recycling. River networks altered nutrient flows. Each factor mattered. Isolating one cause oversimplifies the story. Earth system science emphasizes this interconnectedness. It encourages thinking in terms of systems rather than single variables. The Carnian Pluvial episode fits this framework well, offering a case where geology, atmosphere, hydrology, and life all responded together. It also demonstrates that outcomes depend strongly on initial conditions. The same increase in greenhouse gases would not produce identical effects on a planet with different continents, oceans, or ecosystems. The Carnian world responded as it did because of how it was arranged at the time. Understanding that specificity guards against overgeneralization. This is why responsible climate science avoids simple analogies across eras. The goal is not to equate past and present, but to understand processes. Deep time teaches by example, not by comparison. The Carnian Pluvial episode shows the Earth can absorb change, reorganize itself, and continue operating in a new mode for millions of years. It also shows that these reorganizations have consequences that persist long after the original drivers fade. For scientists, this reinforces the importance of studying both beginnings and endings. It is not enough to know what triggered a climate shift. Understanding how it stabilized and what it left behind is equally important. There is also a quieter lesson about patience. The signals of the Carnian rain were not obvious at first. It took decades of fieldwork, analysis, and debate to recognize the episode as a coherent event. Science advanced slowly, layer by layer, much like the sediments it studies. That process mirrors the climate story itself. Change accumulates, patterns emerge, understanding follows. By looking back at 2 million years of rain, climate science gains not just data, but perspective. It sees how long the Earth can hold a new state, how deeply systems can reorganize, how life adapts within constraints rather than escaping them. The Carnian Pluvial episode does not offer simple answers. It offers depth. It reminds researchers that the most important questions in climate science are often not about what happens next year, but about how systems behave when gently pushed for long periods of time. In that patience lies understanding, and in understanding lies the humility to recognize that Earth's climate, while governed by physical laws, expresses those laws through complexity, memory, and timescales far beyond immediate intuition. The rain fell for 2 million years, not because the planet was fragile, but because it was responsive. That responsiveness is what deep time reveals. 2 million years is a difficult span to hold in mind. It is far longer than any human story, longer than cities, languages, or memory itself. Yet for the Earth, 2 million years is not an abstract number. It is a working timescale. It is long enough for slow processes to finish what they begin. This is why the duration of the Carnian Pluvial episode matters as much as the rain itself. When climate change is discussed, attention often falls on how intense it is, how hot, how wet, how extreme. But intensity alone does not determine consequence. Time does. A small change sustained patiently can outweigh a large change that passes quickly. In biology, time reveals itself through generations. Most organisms do not experience climate change as individuals. They experience it as populations spread across many lifetimes. A 2 million year interval represents an enormous number of generations. For insects, it can mean hundreds of thousands of cycles of birth and reproduction. For reptiles and early dinosaurs, it still spans tens of thousands of generations. Each generation is an opportunity for adjustment. Traits that offer even slight advantages can spread gradually. Behaviors can shift. Developmental patterns can change. Over many generations, these small differences accumulate into visible evolutionary change. This is why persistence matters so much in evolution. A brief wet period might stress a population, but it rarely reshapes it fundamentally. 2 million years does not just test survival. It reshapes what survival looks like. During the Carnian, organisms were not merely enduring rain. They were living their entire evolutionary existence within it. Selection did not ask whether they could tolerate wet conditions temporarily. It asked whether they could function, reproduce, and compete under those conditions indefinitely. That is a different question entirely. Geology tells a similar story of patience. Rocks do not move quickly. Mountains do not rise overnight. River valleys do not carve themselves in a single flood. Yet given enough time, water can rearrange continents. 2 million years of rainfall allowed erosion to do work that short-lived events could not. It allowed rivers to incise deeply, floodplains to thicken, and soils to mature. It allowed chemical reactions between water and rock to progress far beyond surface effects. Geological processes are often described as slow. But this slowness is not weakness. It is reliability. Given time, the outcome is certain. Earth system scientists sometimes describe this as inevitability through accumulation. Not inevitability of a specific outcome, but inevitability that sustained pressure will produce change of some kind. The longer the pressure lasts, the deeper that change tends to go. 2 million years is long enough for Earth to listen. Human intuition struggles with this scale. For people, change is measured in days, years, or lifetimes. Even historical thinking rarely stretches beyond a few thousand years. Against that backdrop, 2 million years can feel meaningless or impossibly remote. But for Earth systems, it is a meaningful duration. It is long enough for oceans to warm and redistribute heat, long enough for atmospheric composition to stabilize at new levels, long enough for ecosystems to reorganize, not once but many times, refining themselves with each pass. Comparing human time to Earth time is not meant to diminish one or elevate the other. It is meant to place them in context. Human systems are fast, responsive, and sensitive to short-term variation. Earth systems are slow, buffered, and resistant to sudden reversal. When the two interact, misunderstanding can arise if the difference in pace is ignored. The Carnian Pluvial episode shows what happens when Earth is given time to respond fully. Rain did not merely fall. It infiltrated, it reacted, it accumulated consequences. Landscape shifted not because of dramatic moments, but because nothing interrupted the process long enough for it to stop. This scale of time also has a calming quality. When viewed from within a single year, persistent rain might feel oppressive. When viewed across 2 million years, it becomes part of a long, coherent transformation. Urgency fades. Patterns emerge. Slow transformation has a rhythm. It is steady rather than violent. It replaces abrupt endings with transitions. It allows life to respond, not just react. This does not mean the Carnian world was gentle or easy for the organisms living through it. Change always carries cost. But the pace allowed adaptation to unfold alongside disruption. Loss occurred, but so did diversification. Decline happened, but so did opportunity. Time softened the edges. This is why duration matters more than any single measurement of rainfall or temperature. It determines whether systems can adjust internally, or whether they are forced into collapse. In the Carnian case, the long duration allowed Earth to reorganize rather than break. From an Earth system perspective, this illustrates a key principle. The most influential changes are often not the fastest ones. They are the ones that persist just long enough to reshape feedbacks. Once feedbacks change, the system behaves differently, even if the original cause fades. That is what makes long-duration events so consequential. 2 million years of rain changed how water moved, how carbon cycled, how nutrients flowed, and how life interacted with the surface. These changes did not vanish when rainfall declined. They became part of the planet's operating structure. There's also something grounding about acknowledging this scale. It reminds the listener that Earth's history is not a sequence of sharp turns, but a series of long curves. Change is rarely sudden from the planet's point of view. It is gradual, layered, and cumulative. By stretching attention across millions of years, urgency gives way to understanding. Complexity becomes easier to hold. Outcomes feel less mysterious when viewed through the lens of time rather than moment. 2 million years is not just a number, it is a force. It allows biology to evolve rather than merely survive. It allows geology to reshape rather than merely fracture. It allows climate to settle into new modes rather than oscillate endlessly. The Carnian Pluvial episode mattered because it lasted long enough for Earth to finish responding. And when the rain finally eased, the planet that emerged was not one that had endured a storm, but one that had lived through an era. Understanding that difference is essential. Because in deep time, what matters most is not how dramatic a change appears at first glance, but how long it stays quietly doing its work. 2 million years was enough. Catastrophe usually arrives in imagination with noise, explosions, impacts, sudden collapse, a clear before and after. But the Carnian Pluvial episode does not fit that picture. If it was a catastrophe at all, it was one that unfolded so slowly that no single moment ever carried the weight of disaster. Nothing happened all at once. There was no day when the rain began everywhere, no year when ecosystems failed simultaneously, no boundary in the rock record where one world clearly ended and another began. Instead, change accumulated quietly, persistently, and unevenly until the planet found itself operating under new rules. This is what makes the Carnian event difficult to recognize as catastrophic in the usual sense. From the perspective of a single organism, most days would have felt ordinary. Rain arrived more often, soil stayed damp longer, rivers wandered, vegetation thickened, life adjusted incrementally. There was no alarm bell to ring, no moment that announced transformation. Yet over time the effects compounded. Species declined without drama. Population shrank. Ranges contracted. Reproductive success faltered. Others expanded just as quietly. Landscapes softened, eroded and reorganized. Nutrient flows intensified. Feedbacks engaged. None of these changes required spectacle to be consequential. This is why no single moment defines the Carnian Pluvial episode. It cannot be reduced to an eruption, a threshold crossing, or a sudden extinction pulse. It is defined instead by duration and accumulation. Each small change made the next more likely. Each adjustment altered the context in which subsequent changes unfolded. Scientists sometimes describe this kind of event as a drawn-out perturbation rather than a crisis. The term may sound understated, but it captures something important. The system was disturbed continuously, not violently. Pressure was applied gently, but relentlessly. Over 2 million years, gentle pressure is enough. Consider the cumulative effects. Rainfall increased modestly, but persistently. That moisture altered weathering rates. Weathering changed soil chemistry. Soils influenced vegetation. Vegetation reshaped water recycling. Rivers expanded. Erosion redistributed nutrients. Ecosystems reorganized. None of these steps required extreme values. They required time. By the time the system reached a visibly different state, no single cause could be isolated. The outcome emerged from interaction, not impact. Climate, geology, biology, and time acted together, each reinforcing the others. This is why scientific framing matters. When the Carnian Pluvial episode is examined through careful stratigraphy, geochemistry, and paleontology, it does not appear as a failure of the Earth system. It appears as a response. The planet adjusted to sustained inputs according to its internal logic. That logic favours balance, but not stasis. Earth does not resist change. It accommodates it, redistributing energy and matter until a new equilibrium emerges. The Carnian rains pushed the system away from aridity. The system responded by reorganizing water flow, landscapes, and life. The cost of that reorganization was real. Species were lost. Ecosystems collapsed locally. Long-established relationships dissolved. But these losses were not concentrated into a single destructive moment. They were spread across time. This spread is what makes the catastrophe quiet. There was no singular villain, no dramatic turning point. Volcanic activity did not explode the biosphere. Rain did not drown the planet. Instead, persistence reshaped the world in ways that could not be undone easily. From a scientific perspective, this reframing is essential. It prevents misunderstanding deep time events as moral narratives of destruction and recovery. The Carnian Pluvial episode was neither punishment nor rescue. It was change. That change had winners and losers, but not because the system judged them. Because traits, environments, and timing interacted in particular ways. Spectacle would actually obscure this understanding. If the event had been sudden, its mechanisms might be simpler to identify, but its lessons would be narrower. Because it was slow, the Carnian teaches something broader about how Earth behaves when nudged for long periods. It teaches that catastrophe does not require chaos. It teaches that stability can emerge from disruption. It teaches that loss does not always arrive with drama. In fact, the most consequential changes often leave the smallest immediate impressions. There is also a caution here against oversimplification. When no single moment defines an event, there is a temptation to underestimate it, to see gradual change as minor, to assume that what unfolds slowly must be less important. The Carnian Pluvial episode challenges that assumption. 2 million years of altered rainfall changed evolutionary pathways. It influenced which lineages persisted and which faded. It reshaped landscapes that would guide water and life for millions of years afterward. It prepared ecological ground for future dominance by dinosaurs without ever announcing that outcome. All of this occurred without a headline. From a distance, the Carnian may appear calm. From within, it was transformative. This is why Earth system scientists pay close attention to cumulative change. They look not for moments of drama, but for trends that persist long enough to engage slow feedbacks. Once those feedbacks respond, the system can move to a new mode of operation. That new mode is not inherently better or worse. It is simply different. The Carnian Pluvial episode represents one such mode shift. A dry world became wetter. A restrained system became more dynamic. A biological landscape once limited by scarcity became reorganized around abundance and competition. None of this required collapse in the cinematic sense. It required patience. In reframing the Carnian as a quiet catastrophe, science does not diminish its importance. It clarifies it. It places the emphasis where it belongs, on process rather than spectacle, on accumulation rather than impact. This perspective also brings a certain calm. Understanding that Earth changes through long-layered processes helps remove the need for urgency or alarmism when studying deep time. It encourages careful observation. It values restraint. It recognizes that complexity unfolds at its own pace. As the long rain faded and the planet settled into its altered state, there was no moment of relief, no closing scene. Life continued, shaped by what had occurred, carrying those changes forward into new contexts. The catastrophe, if it can be called that, had already done its work, quietly, gradually, completely. What remained was not ruin, but a transformed world, ready to be understood, not through drama, but through patience, evidence, and time. At the beginning of this story, the world was defined by dryness. A single vast continent stretched across the planet, its interior far from the reach of ocean moisture. Rivers were unreliable, vegetation was sparse, life endured by patience and restraint. That was the baseline, the quiet starting point from which everything else unfolded. What followed was not a sudden break, but a gradual departure. Volcanoes released gases over long spans of time. The atmosphere warmed gently. Moisture lingered where it once vanished. Rain returned again and again, not as a storm to be endured, but as a condition to be lived within. Over 2 million years, that persistence transformed how the planet functioned. The Carnian Pluvial episode did not remake Earth through force. It did so through consistency. Climatically, the change was subtle in any given moment, yet profound in accumulation. A strengthened greenhouse effect allowed the atmosphere to hold more water. Evaporation increased. Rainfall became more reliable across regions that had once been defined by scarcity. The hydrological cycle settled into a wetter rhythm, sustained long enough to reshape land, life, and chemistry. Landscapes responded patiently. Rivers expanded and interconnected. Floodplains developed where none had existed. Soils deepened and retained moisture. Erosion redistributed nutrients across wide areas. Geography became more dynamic, more responsive to water, more capable of supporting continuous biological activity. Life followed. Plants spread into former margins, turning dust into soil and open ground into living cover. Vegetation altered local climate, recycling moisture and stabilizing surfaces. Nutrient cycles intensified. Ecosystems grew more complex, even as older arrangements weakened or disappeared. Some species thrived, others declined. Loss occurred quietly, not as a single catastrophe, but as prolonged pressure that reshaped ecological balance. The result was not emptiness, but opportunity. New niches opened. Insects diversified, amphibians expanded. Reptiles experimented with new strategies. Evolution responded not with sudden innovation, but with exploration, testing possibilities across thousands of generations. Dinosaurs were part of that background for a long time. They did not dominate the Carnian world. They survived it. Small, adaptable, and efficient, they persisted through instability and found room to expand when conditions later stabilized. Their eventual rise was not written into the rain itself, but into the altered world the rain left behind. This is where contingency enters the story. Earth history is not a straight path toward predetermined outcomes. The dominance of dinosaurs was not inevitable. It emerged because circumstances aligned. Had volcanic activity unfolded differently? Had rainfall persisted longer or faded sooner? Had ecosystems reorganized along other lines? The future could have taken another shape entirely. The Carnian Pluvial episode reminds us of this sensitivity. A modest climatic shift sustained over long enough time redirected evolution. It altered which traits mattered, which strategies endured, and which lineages gained opportunity. Not because the planet intended it, but because complex systems respond to persistent pressure in structured ways. This is the deeper lesson of the long rain. Change does not need drama to matter. It needs time. Over 2 million years, rain reshaped a dry world into one capable of supporting richer, more connected ecosystems. When the rain finally eased, the planet did not return to what it had been. It moved forward, carrying the imprint of what had occurred into every river basin, soil layer, and evolutionary pathway that followed. From that altered foundation, later chapters of Earth's history would unfold, some familiar, some surprising, all contingent on what came before. Seen from a distance, the Carnian Pluvial episode can appear gentle. There were no global extinctions that defined it, no single moment to point to. But its influence ran deep precisely because it was slow, persistent, and systemic. The future was changed not by one event, but by a long interval in which the planet learned how to behave differently. Rain fell, land responded, life adapted, and when the clouds eventually thinned, Earth continued on, not restored, but transformed, carrying forward the quiet consequences of a time when water reshaped possibility itself. This is where the story naturally comes to rest, not at an ending, but at a threshold. A planet settled into a new state, and a future shaped by choices that were never choices at all, only responses to time, chemistry, and rain. What began as a dry world did not end as one. The Carnian Pluvial episode did not arrive with announcement or spectacle, but its consequences extended far beyond the rain itself. Over 2 million years, Earth shifted from a state defined by restraint to one shaped by movement, connection, and possibility. When the rainfall finally eased, the planet that remained was not the same planet that had existed before it began. This is the central arc of the story. At first, the change was atmospheric. Volcanic gases accumulated slowly, thickening the air's ability to retain heat. Warmer air held more moisture. The hydrological cycle intensified, not violently, but persistently. Rain returned to regions that had not known it reliably for tens of millions of years. That persistence mattered more than any individual storm. As moisture became a regular feature rather than an exception, landscapes responded in kind. Rivers expanded and linked distant regions. Floodplains formed and reformed, spreading sediment and nutrients across wide areas. Soils deepened, storing water and supporting life more effectively than before. Ground that once resisted change became responsive to it. The surface of the planet grew more active. Life followed those changes with equal patience. Vegetation spread into former margins, not as a sudden greening, but as a gradual claiming of space. Plants altered the land beneath them and the air above them, recycling water through transpiration and reshaping local climates. Ecosystems grew denser and more interconnected. At the same time, older arrangements began to fail. Species adapted to dry, predictable conditions faced sustained pressure. Habitats destabilized. Reproductive strategies faltered. Extinction occurred quietly, selectively, without a single defining boundary. What disappeared was not life itself, but particular ways of living. In their place, new ecological opportunities emerged. Wetter environments created niches that had not previously existed. Insects diversified alongside expanding plant communities. Amphibians spread where water became dependable. Reptiles experimented with new forms of movement, feeding, and endurance. Evolution did not accelerate because conditions were extreme, but because they remained changed long enough for selection to work. Dinosaurs were part of this background long before they became dominant. They did not rise because the Carnian rains favoured them directly. They rose because the rain altered the structure of ecosystems in ways that later rewarded their traits. Upright posture, efficient locomotion, and flexible diets were not advantages everywhere, but they became increasingly useful in a world shaped by connected landscapes and sustained productivity. Crucially, this outcome was not inevitable. Had volcanic activity waned sooner, had rainfall failed to persist, had ecosystems reorganized differently, dinosaurs might have remained minor players indefinitely. Their eventual success depended on a specific sequence of events unfolding in a particular order over a particular span of time. This is what contingency looks like in Earth history. The Carnian Pluvial episode did not determine the future outright. It narrowed and redirected it. It constrained what was possible, altered what was likely, and reshaped the conditions under which evolution operated. Nothing about this required catastrophe in the dramatic sense. There was no singular collapse, no instant of global failure. Instead, change accumulated until the old baseline no longer applied. By the time the rain eased, the planet had crossed thresholds that could not easily be uncrossed. Rivers followed new paths, soils retained new properties, vegetation occupied new ground, nutrient cycles operated at new intensities. Earth moved forward, not back. This is the deeper meaning of the long rain. It shows that history does not turn only on impacts or crises. It turns on duration, on persistence, on whether a condition lasts long enough to engage slow systems that do not respond to momentary disturbance. 2 million years was enough. Enough time for geology to reshape landscapes. Enough time for biology to restructure ecosystems. Enough time for evolution to explore possibilities that had previously remained closed. When the Carnian Pluvial episode ended, it did not close a chapter cleanly. It dissolved into what followed, leaving behind a planet that behaved differently, quietly carrying its history forward. The rain changed the future not by force, but by staying. And in doing so, it reminds us that the most powerful events in Earth's history are not always the loudest. They are often the ones that unfold slowly, consistently, and without urgency, until the world has no choice but to become something new. This is where the story settles, not at a moment of resolution, but at an understanding. That time itself, when given enough space, is one of the most powerful forces shaping life, climate, and the path the planet ultimately takes. Its evidence is not poetic. It is physical. It appears in rock layers laid down by rivers that did not exist before. It appears in fossil assemblages that record turnover rather than collapse. It appears in soils that grew deeper, richer, and more biologically active, and in drainage systems that continued to guide water long after rainfall declined. The Carnian Pluvial episode is preserved not as a moment, but a structure. What changed was not simply how much rain fell, but how the planet responded when that condition persisted. Over 2 million years, slow processes were given time to complete themselves. Weathering altered chemistry. Erosion reshaped landscapes. Vegetation reorganized surface systems. Ecosystems adjusted generation by generation. No single event explains the outcome. The transformation emerged from accumulation. This is why the Carnian matters. It shows that Earth does not require shock to change direction. Sustained conditions, even modest ones, can redirect climate, biology, and geology when they last long enough to engage slow feedbacks. When the rainfall eased, the planet did not reset. It continued forward from a new baseline, carrying the consequences of that interval into everything that followed. Rivers followed established paths. Soils retained their properties. Ecosystems operated under altered constraints. The world that emerged was not improved or damaged in any moral sense. It was simply different. That difference shaped evolutionary possibilities for tens of millions of years afterward. It influenced which traits proved useful, which strategies endured, and which lineages gained opportunity, not because the planet intended any outcome, but because systems respond to persistence. This is the quiet reality of deep time change. Earth transforms not through moments, but through duration, not through spectacle, but through consistency. When conditions hold, the planet adjusts. When they last long enough, those adjustments become permanent. The Carnian Pluvial episode was one such interval, a long stretch of altered rainfall that reshaped the planet slowly, thoroughly, and without urgency. Understanding that scale does not demand resolution. It offers perspective. The rain ended. The effects did not.